Montana Territory, December 1885. The blizzard howled like a wounded animal, hurling itself against the small cabin with relentless fury. Inside, Sarah Ellison pressed her palm against the weathered logs, feeling the wood tremble beneath her touch. Winter in Montana had teeth sharp and merciless, but this storm seemed particularly vengeful, as if determined to test the limits of human endurance, much like her own life had been tested these past months. Sarah moved away from the wall, one hand instinctively cradling the pronounced curve of her belly. 8 months pregnant and alone in this wilderness, she had become accustomed to conversations with herself and the child within her, the only company available on nights like these. "We'll be fine," she whispered, though whether to reassure the baby or herself remained unclear. "The wood will last until morning. The pantry's stocked. The cabin's held through worse." The fire crackled in response, sending shadows dancing across the worn plank floor. Sarah eased herself into the rocking chair her father had carved years ago, its familiar creak a comfort in the storm-tossed night. Her fingers found the half-finished baby blanket she'd been working on, needle and thread, waiting patiently for her attention. 5 months had passed since Thomas Crawford had kissed her goodbye, his promises of a better future in Denver still warm on his lips. 5 months since he'd placed $20 on the table, all he could spare. He'd claimed and promised to send for her once he'd established himself. 2 months, 3 at most, he'd said, eyes already distant with dreams of prosperity that apparently couldn't accommodate a pregnant wife. "You'll see, Sarah. This opportunity will change everything for us." She'd believed him then. Perhaps because she'd wanted to, perhaps because the alternative that he was abandoning her and their unborn child was too painful to contemplate. But as weeks stretched into months with no word, Sarah had been forced to accept a harsher truth. Thomas wasn't coming back. The baby kicked a firm pressure against her ribs that momentarily stole her breath. "You're restless tonight," she murmured, setting aside her sewing to rub gentle circles over the spot. "Like your mother, I suppose. Never content when there's a storm brewing." Outside, the wind changed direction, driving snow against the cabin's single window with a sound like sand against glass. Sarah glanced toward the woodpile near the hearth. It would need replenishing before morning, which meant venturing to the covered storage beside the cabin, a task that grew more challenging with each passing day as her body expanded and her balance shifted. She rose, carefully moving with the deliberate grace of a woman who had learned that haste often led to accidents she could ill afford. Wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders, Sarah paused at the door, gathering her resolve before facing the frigid onslaught outside. The moment she opened the door, the wind tried to tear it from her grasp, forcing her to lean her full weight against the wood to prevent it from slamming against the cabin wall. Snow immediately assaulted her face, tiny needles of ice that stung her exposed skin. She squinted through the swirling white, calculating the 6 steps to the wood storage, when something caught her eye. A dark shape collapsed near the path. At first, she thought a branch had fallen from one of the pines that surrounded her property. But branches didn't wear clothes, and they certainly didn't have the broad shoulders of a man. "Hello," Sarah called, her voice immediately swallowed by the storm. The figure didn't move, either unconscious or the thought sent ice through her veins, already dead frozen in the merciless Montana winter. Common sense told her to retreat inside to bar the door against both storm and stranger. A woman alone, heavily pregnant, had no business involving herself with unknown men who appeared during blizzards. But Sarah Ellison had not survived this long by abandoning those in need, not even when her own circumstances were precarious. With one hand braced against the cabin wall for support, she made her way toward the prone figure, her boots breaking through the fresh snow crust with each laborious step. Up close, she could see it was indeed a man, his face turned away, half buried in snow. He wore a heavy coat that had done little to protect him from the elements, and his hands, curled loosely near his face, were encased in what appeared to be fine leather gloves, an impractical choice for Montana winter. "Sir." She touched his shoulder, then shook it more firmly when he didn't respond. "Can you hear me?" Nothing, but when her fingers pressed against his neck, she felt a pulse, faint but present. Still alive then, though not for long if he remained in the cold. Sarah straightened, surveying the distance between the unconscious stranger and her cabin door. She couldn't possibly carry him, not in her condition. But leaving him to die wasn't an option her conscience would allow. "You've chosen a terrible time to test my Christian charity," she muttered, bending awkwardly to grasp the man beneath his arms. The effort of dragging him toward the cabin left her breathless pain shooting across her lower back with each backward step. The stranger was tall, solidly built, and entirely uncooperative in his unconscious state. By the time she managed to pull him over the threshold, Sarah's face was slick with perspiration despite the bitter cold, and she feared her exertions might have triggered early labor. She paused, one hand pressed to her abdomen, waiting for the tightness to pass. When it did, she closed the door against the howling night and turned her attention to her unexpected guest. In the firelight, she could see him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps early 30s, with features that spoke of good breeding and comfortable circumstances. His clothes, now that she could examine them, confirmed her initial impression. This man was no ordinary traveler. Beneath his snow-crusted outer garments, he wore a fine wool coat, tailored shirt, and beneath the leather gloves, his hands showed no calluses or evidence of manual labor. A rich man, then. Lost or separated from companions, perhaps. No one in their right mind traveled alone through these mountains in December. "Well, sir," Sarah said as she struggled to remove his wet outer clothing, "I don't know what brought you to my doorstep, but it seems God has decided I needed more complications in my life." She managed to drag him closer to the hearth, arranging his limbs as comfortably as possible on the rug before adding more wood to the fire. His breathing remained shallow, his skin pale with the particular bloodless quality that accompanied severe cold. She'd seen frostbite before Montana winters claimed fingers and toes with ruthless regularity, and she feared this stranger might lose some extremities before morning. Working methodically, Sarah removed his remaining wet garments tactfully, leaving his underclothes in place for both their dignities. She covered him with every spare blanket she possessed, then set water to boil for tea, laced with the herbs her mother had taught her, might help raise body temperature safely. It was past midnight before she saw any improvement in his condition. By then, Sarah had settled into her rocking chair beside him, darning needleworking steadily on one of his fine wool socks, an incongruously elegant garment that seemed to embody the mystery of its unconscious owner. The stranger stirred, a soft moan escaping his lips as consciousness began to return. Sarah set aside her mending, leaning forward to study his face. His eyelids fluttered, then opened to reveal dark eyes clouded with confusion. "Don't try to move," she said gently. "You nearly froze to death out there." He blinked slowly, gaze traveling from her face to his surroundings, the cabin's rough-hewn walls, the modest furnishings, the crackling fire, before returning to her with dawning comprehension. "You," his voice emerged as a croak. "You saved me." "Any decent person would have done the same," Sarah replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The frontier had a way of turning even decent people practical, and practicality rarely extended to dragging strange men indoors during blizzards. "Where?" He swallowed with the difficulty. "Where am I?" "My cabin, about 15 miles northeast of Cooper's Creek." She reached for the cup of herbal tea she prepared. "Can you sit up? You should try to drink this." With her assistance, he managed to raise himself enough to sip the warm liquid. His hands trembled visibly, and Sarah found herself supporting the cup to prevent spillage. "Thank you," he said when he'd finished, his voice stronger, though still rough with disuse. "I'm Wesley Holly." The name meant nothing to Sarah, though something in the way he said it suggested it should. "Sarah Ellison," she offered in return. "Mrs. Ellison." He acknowledged, gaze dropping briefly to her protruding belly before returning to her face with newfound respect. "I've imposed terribly on your hospitality." There was something practiced in his courtesy, a polish that spoke of Eastern education and social standing. Sarah found herself wondering what series of misfortunes had led such a man to collapse outside her isolated cabin. "How did you come to be out in this weather, Mr. Holly? It's no night for traveling, especially alone." A shadow crossed his features. "It wasn't by choice, I assure you." He attempted to sit up further, but fell back with a grimace of pain. "I was separated from my horse during the storm. Became disoriented." It wasn't the full story. Sarah could sense the careful omissions in his account, but she didn't press. Everyone on the frontier carried secrets. Some were best left undisturbed. "You're welcome to shelter here until the storm passes," she said, rising to add another log to the fire. "Though I'm afraid accommodations are modest." Wesley's gaze traveled around the cabin once more, taking in the single room with its sleeping area, partitioned by a simple curtain, the small table with two chairs, the shelves lined with preserved food and necessary supplies. "You live here alone?" he asked, then immediately seemed to regret the question. "Forgive me, that's not my business." "My husband is in Denver," Sarah replied, the familiar explanation coming automatically. "He'll send for me once he's established." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, a recitation she no longer believed, but continued from habit. Wesley seemed to hear the doubt beneath her statement, but was gentleman enough not to comment. Instead, he struggled again to sit up, this time succeeding, though the effort clearly cost him. "I should find my horse when the storm breaks," he said. "Continue my journey." "To where, if I might ask?" He hesitated, that shadow crossing his features again. "North, as far as necessary." "From a Texas." His hand moved to his inner coat pocket, checking for something before relaxing slightly. "The Holly Cattle Company." This time the name registered. Sarah had heard of the Holly operation, one of the largest cattle empires in Texas, with holdings that spanned thousands of acres and employed hundreds of men. If Wesley was connected to that family, it explained his fine clothes and educated manner. "Long way from home," she observed. "Not by choice," he repeated more quietly this time. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the cabin, a reminder that whatever circumstances had brought Wesley Holly to her door, he wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. The storm had them both trapped in this small space, their futures temporarily suspended by forces beyond human control. Sarah returned to her rocking chair, picking up her darning once more. The rhythmic movement of the needle through wool helped order her thoughts, settling the unease that came with having a stranger, particularly a male stranger, in her private space. "You should rest," she said after a long silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. "Morning will come soon enough, and with it, decisions about what comes next." Wesley nodded, though his eyes remained open, watching the flames with an intensity that suggested his mind was far from restful. "Mrs. Ellison," he said finally, "I'm deeply in your debt. Not many would have risked themselves for a stranger." Sarah's hands stilled on her work. "Perhaps not," she agreed, "but I've found that survival in these parts often depends on the kindness of others. Today it was you in need. Tomorrow it might be me." It was a practical philosophy born of frontier experience rather than sentimentality. But as she watched Wesley Holly finally surrender to exhaustion, his breathing deepening into sleep, Sarah couldn't help wondering if she'd just invited trouble into her carefully ordered world, trouble she could ill afford with a baby due in mere weeks and resources already stretched thin. The storm, oblivious to human concerns, continued its siege through the long night hours. While inside the cabin, two strangers from vastly different worlds shared the same small circle of warmth, their futures entangled in ways neither could yet imagine. By morning, the storm had mellowed from a raging fury to a steady, determined snowfall that promised to continue throughout the day. Sarah woke with the first gray light, her body stiff from sleeping upright in the rocking chair. She'd intended to move to her bed once Wesley was asleep, but exhaustion had claimed her before she could make the transfer. Wesley still slept near the hearth, his color much improved from the alarming pallor of the previous night. In sleep, his features had softened, revealing a younger man than stress had made him appear. Sarah studied him thoughtfully as she kindled the morning fire, noting the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of someone accustomed to both laughter and responsibility. The domestic sounds of her preparations eventually roused him. He sat up slowly, wincing as his cold, stiffened muscles protested the movement. "Good morning," Sarah greeted him, setting a pot of coffee to boil. "How are you feeling?" "And like I've been trampled by a herd of longhorns," Wesley admitted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "But considerably better than I should be, thanks to your intervention. You were fortunate I needed more firewood." "Indeed." His gaze traveled to the window where snow continued to fall in a peaceful counterpoint to last night's violence. "Though it appears I'm still imposing on your hospitality." "The storm won't last forever," Sarah replied, though they both understood the implications of heavy snowfall in these mountains. Even after the weather cleared, travel would remain difficult, perhaps impossible for days. "Mrs. Ellison," Wesley began, then hesitated. "I realize I've arrived under unusual circumstances, but I hope you'll allow me to explain myself more fully." Sarah turned from the stove, where she'd been preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush. "That's not necessary, Mr. Holly. Your business is pure own." "Under normal conditions, I'd agree, But when a man is dependent on a woman's charity, particularly a woman in your condition, he owes her at least the courtesy of honesty. There was something refreshing about his directness, a quality Sarah had found lacking in most men of her acquaintance. She gestured toward the table. Very well, but you should eat first. Explanations are better offered on a full stomach. They shared the meal in relative silence, Wesley consuming his portion with the appreciation of someone who had genuinely feared never eating again. Sarah found herself wondering how long he had been traveling before collapsing outside her cabin, and under what circumstances. When they had finished and the dishes were cleared, Wesley remained at the table turning his coffee cup between his hands, as if gathering thoughts. Sarah resumed her seat across from him, waiting patiently. I am indeed Wesley Holly, he began, son of Charles Holly, who founded the Holly Cattle Company 30 years ago. I was raised to inherit that operation, educated in Boston, trained in every aspect of the business, groomed to take my father's place when the time came. He paused, his gaze fixed on the dark liquid in his cup. That time was approaching faster than any of us anticipated. My father's health has been declining, and with it, I'm afraid, our financial stability. A series of bad investments coupled with increased competition and falling cattle prices has left the company vulnerable. Sarah nodded. Such boom and bust cycles were common in the West, where fortunes could be made and lost with alarming speed. My father's solution was a merger, specifically a marriage between myself and Eleanor Whitman, daughter of James Whitman, who owns the largest ranch in eastern Texas. The combination of our operations would create an empire spanning from the Gulf Coast to the Oklahoma border. Wesley's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. A brilliant business strategy. Except, Sarah prompted when he fell silent, except that I've never loved Eleanor. She's a perfectly lovely woman, educated, accomplished, suitable in every way according to my father's calculations. But, he finally looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze directly. I believe there should be more to marriage than sound business judgment. The sentiment struck Sarah with particular force considering her own circumstances. Thomas had courted her with pretty words about love and partnership promises that had evaporated when faced with the reality of pregnancy and limited prospects in Montana. Your father disagreed, she said, already knowing the answer, vehemently. Wesley set down his cup with a finality that suggested deeper conflict than he was revealing. He married my mother for her family's connections and has never pretended otherwise. Their marriage produced heirs and expanded our holdings, which he considers the only measures that matter. So you ran. I chose freedom, he corrected gently, though at the moment that freedom appears to have led me into a rather desperate situation. Sarah considered him thoughtfully. There was more to the story. She could sense it in the careful way he selected his words, the tension that remained in his shoulders despite his apparent candor. But she recognized the courage it had taken to abandon a life of privilege for uncertainty, even if she questioned the wisdom of such a decision. What will you do now? She asked. Wesley glanced toward the window where the snow continued its steady descent. When the weather permits, continue north, perhaps into Canada, where the Holly name carries less weight. In your family, they'll be searching for you. Undoubtedly, my father doesn't surrender valuable assets easily, and he considers me precisely that, an asset to be deployed for maximum return on investment. The bitterness in his tone surprised her, revealing wounds deeper than mere rebellion against an arranged marriage might suggest. Sarah found herself wondering what kind of father could reduce his son to a business commodity, and what kind of life Wesley had led before choosing exile. Well, Mr. Holly, she said finally, it seems we're both refugees from promises that weren't worth keeping. The observation hung between them, creating an unexpected connection. Wesley studied her with renewed interest. Your husband, he said carefully. Thomas, was it? Thomas Crawford. The name still tasted like disappointment on her tongue. A businessman from Denver who convinced me that love could overcome practical considerations. Yet he left you here alone. He had opportunities that couldn't wait for a baby's arrival. Sarah kept her tone neutral, though the hurt had dulled to a manageable ache in the months since his departure. Left me $20 in promises to send for me once he was established. And you believed him. For about 3 days, she admitted. Then I realized that a man who could walk away from his pregnant fiancée had never intended to keep any promises he'd made. Wesley was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the parallels between their situations. Both of them had been betrayed by people who claimed to care for them, his father, by demanding a loveless marriage, her lover, by abandoning her when love became complicated. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "No woman should face motherhood alone. And no man should be forced to marry someone he doesn't love," she replied, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. "Though I suppose the world is full of people doing things they never thought they'd have to do." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly forceful kick, making Sarah wince and press her hand to her side. Wesley's eyes immediately dropped to her swollen belly, and she saw understanding dawn in his expression. "How long?" he asked gently. "A month, perhaps less." She met his gaze steadily, daring him to judge her as others had. Instead of the disapproval she half expected, she saw something like kinship in his face. "It seems we're both caught in circumstances not entirely of our own making," he observed. "Yet still responsible for our choices," Sarah countered. She rose from the table, needing to move to establish the normal rhythms of her day, despite the disruption of Wesley's presence. "Speaking of which, I have chores that won't wait, storm or no storm. Let me help." Wesley stood too quickly, swaying slightly as his body reminded him of its recent ordeal. "Please, it's the least I can do to repay your kindness." Sarah hesitated. Pride urged her to refuse. She had managed alone these past months, after all, but practicality suggested accepting assistance while it was available. There were tasks that had become increasingly difficult as her pregnancy advanced, and the heavy snow would only add to her daily burdens. "Very well," she agreed finally. "Though I doubt you've had much experience with frontier chores, Mr. Holly." A genuine smile transformed his features, erasing the shadows that had lingered since their conversation began. "None whatsoever," he admitted cheerfully, "but I'm told I'm a quick study." The morning passed in a strange domestic partnership that should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. Wesley proved both willing and attentive, following Sarah's instructions with the careful concentration of a man determined to master unfamiliar skills. His technique with the goats was abysmal. At first, his city-soft hands unused to the firm, yet gentle pressure required for milking, but he persisted until the animals grudgingly accepted his ministrations. "They can sense when you're uncertain," Sarah explained, watching him struggle with the more temperamental of her two nanny goats. "Talk to them. Animals respond to voice and manner more than technique." "What should I say to a goat?" Wesley asked, genuinely puzzled. "Whatever comes naturally. Tell her about your day, your troubles, your hopes." Goats are excellent listeners and terrible gossips. The suggestion drew a smile from him, the first truly relaxed expression she'd seen since his arrival. "Well, Buttercup," he said to the brown goat, his voice taking on a conversational tone, "I suppose you'd like to know how a man goes from discussing cattle futures in boardrooms to learning barnyard skills from a woman who puts most men to shame." The goat's ears perked forward, and the milk began flowing more freely. Sarah found herself smiling, too charmed by his willingness to embrace what must have seemed an absurd situation to someone of his background. "The truth is," he continued to the goat, his hands finding the proper rhythm, "I've learned more about genuine satisfaction in the past day than in 32 years of doing what was expected of me. There's something deeply satisfying about work that produces immediate, tangible results." "Careful, Mr. Holly," Sarah warned, though her tone was teasing. "You're starting to sound like a convert to honest labor." "Maybe I am," he replied seriously. "Maybe that's what I've been searching for, without knowing it, the chance to build something with my own efforts, rather than simply managing what others built before me." The sentiment resonated with Sarah more deeply than she cared to admit. Her own parents had built this cabin, this life, with their hands, and determination passing to her not wealth, but the skills and courage to face whatever challenges arose. It was a different kind of inheritance than Wesley had received, but perhaps ultimately more valuable. "Your family," she said as they returned to the cabin, arms laden with firewood and milk pails. "Will they truly come looking for you?" Wesley's expression sobered. "Eventually. My father isn't accustomed to being defied, and the Whitman merger is too important to abandon without a fight. But Montana in winter should provide adequate concealment until I can make more permanent arrangements." "Unless you freeze to death in a blizzard," Sarah pointed out dryly. "There is that risk," he acknowledged with a rueful smile, "though I seem to have found an unexpected guardian angel despite my poor planning." The compliment, delivered without artifice, brought unexpected warmth to Sarah's cheeks. She busied herself with straining the milk, uncomfortable with the direction of her thoughts. Wesley Holly was a temporary visitor in her life, a man passing through on his way to somewhere else. Allowing herself to feel anything beyond basic Christian charity toward him would be foolish in the extreme. Yet as the day progressed, she found herself enjoying his company in a way she hadn't enjoyed anyone since Thomas's departure. Wesley possessed a quality Thomas had lacked: a genuine interest in her thoughts and experiences, a willingness to listen as well as speak. When she mentioned her mother's skill with herbal remedies, he asked intelligent questions about the properties of different plants. When she described her father's craftsmanship in building the cabin, he examined the joinery with obvious appreciation for the workmanship. By evening, when they shared a simple meal of cornbread and bean soup, it felt as if they had known each other much longer than a single day. The storm continued outside, a constant reminder that their isolation was enforced rather than chosen. Yet Sarah found herself grateful for the unexpected companionship it had brought. "Tell me about your parents," Wesley said, as they sat before the fire after dinner, the howling wind creating a cocoon of intimacy around their conversation. "You speak of them in the past tense." "They both passed 4 years ago," Sarah replied, her fingers automatically reaching for her mending basket, a habit when discussing difficult topics. "Influenza swept through the valley that winter. Many families lost someone." "I'm sorry." The simple words carried genuine empathy. "Were you alone then as well?" "Not entirely. I was married to John Ellison at the time." She selected a sock from her basket, focusing on the familiar task rather than the memories his question evoked. "He died 2 years later. Mining accident." "And then Thomas," Sarah nodded, her needle moving steadily through wool. "He came through Cooper's Creek selling farm equipment. Handsome, charming, full of stories about opportunities back east. I was lonely, I suppose. Vulnerable to someone who seemed to see beyond the widow Ellison." Wesley was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "You loved him," he said finally. "Not a question, but an observation." "I thought I did." The admission cost her something, though she wasn't sure what. "Now I wonder if I simply loved the idea of not being alone." "There's no shame in that," Wesley said softly. "Loneliness can be as devastating as any disease." The understanding in his voice made her look up, meeting his gaze across the small space between them. In the firelight, his eyes held shadows that spoke of his own familiarity with isolation, a surprising revelation for a man raised amid wealth and social connection. "What about you?" she asked, turning the conversation away from her own history. "Your family in Texas, tell me about them." Wesley leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "My father is a brilliant businessman who sees every relationship in terms of profit and loss. He genuinely believes that love is a weakness that interferes with sound judgment." He paused, staring into the fire. "My mother learned to find satisfaction in social prominence and charitable works, accepting that affection was less important than security." "Were they ever happy?" "I think they were content, which my father considers more valuable than happiness. Content people don't make impulsive decisions that threaten family fortunes." The assessment was delivered without bitterness, but Sarah sensed the years of quiet disappointment behind it, the gradual realization that his parents' marriage offered a model he couldn't bear to replicate. "What about yours?" he asked, glancing back at her. "Your parents, were they happy together?" Sarah's expression softened with memory. "They loved each other with the kind of devotion that seems almost foolish when you're young but starts to look like wisdom as you get older. Papa courted Mama for 2 years before she'd even consider marrying him, said she wanted to be sure he loved her for herself and not just her father's land." "And did he?" "He loved her so completely that when she died, he never looked at another woman, spent the rest of his life talking to her gravestone like she was sitting right beside him." Sarah wiped away a tear she hadn't realized had formed. "He used to say that some people are lucky enough to find their other half in this world, and the rest just have to make do with companionship." Wesley was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words. "I used to think my parents' marriage sounded practical," he said eventually. "A brilliant man ensuring financial security, a socially adept woman managing the domestic sphere. But listening to you describe your parents, I'm beginning to think they might have been the ones who settled for less than they deserved." The observation hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither was ready to fully explore. Outside, the wind had begun to ease, suggesting the storm might finally be weakening its hold on the valley. Inside, two people who had found each other through the most unlikely circumstances sat in companionable silence, each contemplating paths not taken and choices that still lay ahead. "It's getting late," Sarah said, finally setting aside her mending with reluctance. The evening's conversation had provided a respite from the solitude that had become her constant companion, and she was oddly unwilling to see it end. "You should take the bed. I'll make up a pallet here by the fire." "Absolutely not," Wesley protested. "I've imposed enough without taking your bed. The floor is perfectly adequate for someone who nearly froze to death yesterday." His stubborn expression suggested argument would be futile, a trait Sarah recognized from her own reflection. "Very well," she conceded, "but at least take the extra quilt." The fire dies down considerably before morning. As they prepared for sleep, moving around each other in the small cabin, with a domesticity that should have felt awkward but somehow didn't, Sarah found herself wondering what tomorrow would bring. The storm would end, eventually the snow would begin its slow retreat, and Wesley Holly would continue his journey north, taking with him the brief companionship that had brightened her isolation. The thought left an unexpected hollowness in her chest, a reminder that some connections, however brief, could leave lasting impressions on a heart too long accustomed to solitude. The storm released its grip on the valley over the next 3 days, gradually yielding to clear skies and bitter cold that transformed the landscape into a glittering frozen wilderness. Inside the cabin, however, warmth flourished in unexpected ways as Sarah and Wesley settled into a routine that bridged their vastly different backgrounds. Wesley proved an eager student of frontier skills, approaching each new task with the same determination he might once have applied to business negotiations or social obligations. His hands, soft from years of privileged existence, began to develop calluses from splitting wood and carrying water buckets. Burns from tending the fire and small cuts from repairing loose cabin boards became badges of accomplishment rather than marks of failure. More surprising to Sarah was his genuine interest in her daily life, not as a curiosity or temporary adventure, but as a legitimate way of existing in the world. He asked thoughtful questions about preserving food for winter, listened attentively to her explanations of weather patterns in the mountains, and studied her mother's handwritten book of herbal remedies with scholarly concentration. "Your mother was remarkably knowledgeable," he observed on the fourth evening, carefully turning the pages of the worn journal Sarah had entrusted to him. "These preparations are as sophisticated as any pharmaceutical compound I've seen." "She learned from her mother and she from hers," Sarah replied, working on the baby blanket that had become her evening project. "Knowledge passed down through generations of women who couldn't rely on doctors or apothecaries when illness struck." Wesley nodded his finger, tracing a recipe for fever reduction. "Yet modern medicine dismisses such wisdom as folk superstition. I wonder how many valuable treatments have been lost because they originated with women rather than university-trained physicians." The observation revealed a mind more flexible than Sarah had initially credited him, with a willingness to question established authority that explained much about his break with family expectations. Their conversations during these evenings ranged widely from practical matters of survival to philosophical questions about purpose and meaning. Wesley proved an engaging narrator, sharing stories of cattle drives and ranch life that painted vivid pictures of a world vastly different from her frontier existence. But it was his quieter reflections that revealed the most, his sense of being trapped in a role that fit him poorly, his growing conviction that there had to be more to life than profitable marriages and business expansion. In turn, Sarah found herself sharing memories she had kept private since Thomas's departure. Her parents' loving partnership, her brief happiness with John before his death, her hopes for the child growing within her. There was something in Wesley's attentive listening that invited confidence, a quality of genuine interest that made even difficult topics easier to discuss. On the fifth day, when the weak winter sunshine sparkled across unblemished snow, Wesley discovered Sarah's mother's wedding blanket while helping her rearrange the sleeping area to better accommodate her advancing pregnancy. "This is exquisite," he said, carefully unfolding the cream-colored wool with its intricate pattern of intertwined roses. "Did you make this?" Sarah took the blanket from him, her fingers tracing the delicate needlework with reverent familiarity. "My mother began it for her own wedding, but never finished. She always said she'd complete it someday when she had daughters to marry." Her voice softened with memory. "Now I'm finishing it for my baby, hoping she'll understand someday that love persists across generations, even when people don't." The sadness in her words seemed to reach something deep in Wesley's chest. Without conscious thought, he covered her hand with his offering comfort through touch that spoke louder than any verbal reassurance. She will understand, he said quietly. Children born from love always recognize it, even when the world tries to convince them otherwise. Their eyes met and held, acknowledging what had been growing between them, despite every practical reason why it shouldn't. He was a wealthy heir running from family expectations. She was a pregnant woman abandoned by the man who'd sworn to love her. Their circumstances should have made anything beyond friendship impossible, yet something deeper than logic was drawing them together with irresistible force. The moment was broken by a sharp pain that made Sarah gasp and press her hand to her side. The baby had been unusually active lately, her movements becoming more pronounced as space grew scarce. This particular kick, however, was strong enough to take Sarah's breath away. "Are you all right?" Wesley's concern was immediate, his hand moving instinctively to support her elbow. "She's just reminding me that she's running out of room," Sarah managed, though the intensity of the movement had left her shaken. The midwife in town said, "Active babies are healthy babies, but I'm beginning to wonder if this one intends to kick her way into the world." "How long since you've seen a doctor?" The question revealed his privileged background as clearly as his fine clothes had the night she found him. In his world, medical care was readily available, pregnancy monitored by professionals, birth attended by skilled physicians. In her world, women managed with folk wisdom, neighbor women, and prayers that nothing went wrong during the most dangerous hours of their lives. "There's no doctor closer than Cooper's Creek, and that's 15 miles through country that's been impassable for weeks," she explained. "Most women here rely on experience and hope." The inadequacy of such arrangements clearly troubled Wesley. That night, Sarah woke to find him standing by the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape with an expression of deep concentration. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. He turned, and even in the dim light, she could see the conflict in his features. "I keep thinking about what you said about dealing with complications as they come. In my world, we plan for contingencies, have resources available for every possibility. The idea that you might face childbirth without proper medical care." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "It feels wrong to know you're taking such risks alone." "I'm not alone anymore," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Wesley crossed the cabin in 3 quick strides, settling on the edge of her bed with careful attention to propriety, even as his emotions clearly urged him closer. "Sarah," he said, her name a prayer and a question all at once. "This is foolish," she whispered, even as she made no move to increase the distance between them. "You're running from one impossible situation. You don't need to complicate your life with another." "What if I want the complication?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What if I've discovered that a complicated life with someone I care about is infinitely preferable to a simple life with someone I don't?" The honesty of his confession broke down her remaining defenses. Here was a man who could have any woman he wanted, whose family connections could secure him a comfortable future, yet he was offering his heart to a pregnant woman with nothing to give but her own scarred affection. "You don't know what you're saying," she protested weakly. "Once this baby comes, once the reality of raising another man's child sets in, this baby," he interrupted, his hand moving to rest gently on her rounded belly, "would be lucky to have a mother who's shown such courage and strength. And any man would be fortunate to help raise a child who's already survived so much adversity." And the tenderness in his touch, the certainty in his voice, nearly undid her completely. She'd spent months preparing to face motherhood alone, steeling herself for the challenges of raising a child without support or security. The possibility that someone might willingly share those burdens, might even find joy in them, was almost too wonderful to believe. "Your family will never accept this," she said, though her resistance was crumbling with each gentle movement of his thumb across her belly. "Then perhaps it's time I learned to live without their acceptance," he replied. "I've spent 32 years trying to meet expectations that were never mine to begin with. Maybe it's time I set my own standards for what constitutes a successful life." Outside, the wind that had been their constant companion for days finally stilled, leaving a silence so complete it felt sacred. Inside the cabin, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances began to acknowledge that some connections transcend logic, social position, and practical considerations. When Wesley finally returned to his makeshift bed near the hearth, the space between them felt charged with possibility. Both knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful boundaries they'd maintained were no longer sufficient to contain what was growing between them. The morning would bring new challenges, new questions about the future. But for now, they had the peace of knowing they were no longer facing those challenges alone. The week that followed deepened their connection in ways neither had anticipated. Wesley's concern for Sarah's welfare manifested in practical improvements to the cabin, a more efficient arrangement of the cooking area, repairs to drafty sections of the walls, a cleverly designed shelf that put frequently used items within easier reach. Each modification demonstrated both his growing competence with tools and his attentive observation of her daily challenges. Sarah, in turn, found herself sharing knowledge accumulated through years of frontier living. How to predict weather changes from cloud patterns, which wild plants could supplement their diet. When spring arrived, the subtle signs that distinguished harmless wildlife tracks from potential predators. Skills her parents had imparted that now formed a bridge between her world and Wesley's. They spoke less directly about feelings than they did about practical matters, yet emotion infused even their most mundane interactions. When their hands brushed while preparing meals, when Wesley steadied her as she navigated icy ground between cabin and outbuildings, when Sarah adjusted his grip on an axe handle to prevent blisters, each contact carried meaning beyond its immediate purpose. "I found this," Wesley said one evening, carefully withdrawing a leather-bound journal from his coat pocket. "I thought perhaps you might want to read it." Sarah accepted the book with surprise, immediately recognizing it as Wesley's personal journal, from the gold leaf initials embossed on the cover. "Are you certain," she asked, aware of the intimacy such an offering represented? "Journals are private things." "They are," he agreed, "but I'd like you to understand what brought me here, not just the circumstances, but the questions I've been asking myself for longer than I care to admit." The trust implied by his gesture touched her deeply. Sarah opened the journal with careful reverence, her eyes falling on entries that revealed a thoughtful, questioning mind, struggling against conventions that had shaped his entire existence. January 15th, 1885. Father presented the Whitman proposal today as if announcing a particularly advantageous cattle purchase. Eleanor's dowry, her father's political connections, the combined acreage, all calculated to the penny. Not once did he mention happiness or compatibility, let alone love. When I raised these considerations, he looked at me as if I'd suggested evaluating livestock based on their singing abilities. "Marriage is a business arrangement, son. Love is a luxury we can't afford." I wonder if he's ever afforded it, even privately. March 30th, 1885. Dinner with the Whitmans. Eleanor was perfectly pleasant, perfectly appropriate, perfectly dull. We discussed the weather, the latest Boston fashions, and her father's new breeding program for shorthorns. Not once did her eyes light with passion or interest. She's been trained like me to perform her role without questioning its purpose. I pity her almost as much as I pity myself. June 17th, 1885. Walked the south pasture alone today, watching the men move cattle towards summer grazing. Rodriguez has worked this land for 20 years, owns nothing but his horse and saddle. Yet there's a contentment in his face I haven't seen in the mirror for longer than I can remember. Is it possible that building something with your own hands, however humble, provides more satisfaction than inheriting an empire built by others? The entries continued, documenting Wesley's growing disillusionment with the path laid out for him and his gradual awakening to alternatives. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks earlier, contained a resolution that had clearly led him to her doorstep. December 1st, 1885, wedding date set for January 10th. Father overrode all objections. "The merger documents are already drawn up," he said, as if that settled everything. "Perhaps for him it does. But I find I cannot proceed, not without sacrificing whatever remnant of authentic self remains beneath years of Holly conditioning. Tomorrow I leave for the north. Father will be furious, mother heartbroken. The Whitmans insulted. The company may suffer. Yet for the first time in my adult life, I can breathe. Whatever comes next, at least it will be a path I've chosen, rather than merely accepted." Sarah closed the journal, deeply moved by the vulnerability it revealed. The man sitting across from her had risked everything: family, fortune, social, standing for the chance to live authentically. It was a courage she hadn't fully appreciated until seeing the documented progression of his decision. "Thank you," she said simply, returning the journal to him, "for trusting me with this." Wesley accepted it with a nod, his expression serious. "I wanted you to know that what I said the other night wasn't impulse or infatuation. It was the culmination of years questioning what truly matters in a life well lived." "And what answer have you found?" His gaze held hers steadily. "That connection, real connection, based on mutual understanding and respect, is worth more than all the cattle in Texas or all the business mergers in Boston." The conviction in his voice made her heart race, but Sarah had learned caution through bitter experience. "Wesley," she said carefully, using his first name deliberately to acknowledge the intimacy that had grown between them, "I've made the mistake once of building hopes on promises that proved insubstantial. I can't afford to make it again, not with a child depending on me." "I understand." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I'm not asking for immediate decisions or declarations, only that you consider the possibility that sometimes the most unlikely circumstances can lead to the most meaningful connections." Outside, a lone wolf howled in the distance, its voice carrying clearly through the crisp night air. Inside, Sarah Ellison faced the most important crossroads of her life, the choice between protective solitude and the risk of opening her heart to possibility once more. The baby kicked again, a gentle reminder of all that was at stake in her decision. Wesley's hand remained over hers, warm and steady, offering, without demanding, suggesting a future that neither of them could clearly envision, but both were beginning to desire. "I'll consider it," she said, finally turning her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. It wasn't a promise or a commitment, but it was an opening, a willingness to explore what might grow between them if given the chance. For now, that would have to be enough. The arrival of the new year brought subtle shifts to the Montana landscape. Though winter maintained its firm grip on the valley, the days had begun to lengthen almost imperceptibly, and occasionally the bitter cold would ease, offering brief reprieves that hinted at a spring still months away. Inside the cabin, changes more profound than seasonal transitions were taking place. What had begun as an emergency arrangement between strangers had evolved into something neither Sarah nor Wesley could have anticipated: a partnership built on shared daily tasks, evening conversations, and growing emotional connection. Wesley had fully recovered from his near-freezing experience, his body adapting to physical labor with surprising resilience. The transformation wasn't merely physical. Sarah observed a lightness in his demeanor that suggested freedom from long-carried burdens. When he split wood or repaired fence sections damaged by snow, he approached the work not as obligation, but as discovery. Each completed task adding to his growing confidence in his ability to exist outside the privileged world he'd abandoned. For Sarah, the changes were more subtle but equally significant. Her pregnancy had advanced to its final stages, the baby's movements now vigorous enough to be visible through her clothing. With Wesley's steady presence, the anxiety that had accompanied these developments began to recede, replaced by cautious anticipation. Though she remained practical about the challenges ahead, the prospect of facing them with support rather than in isolation made them seem less daunting. One crisp morning in early January, Sarah stood at the cabin's single window, watching Wesley clear a path to the barn where her goats and chickens waited for their daily attention. Something in his confident stride, the way he attacked the snow, with methodical determination, stirred emotions she had carefully contained since their conversation over his journal. "He's not Thomas," she whispered to herself, one hand resting on her rounded belly. But perhaps that's precisely the point. The baby kicked vigorously as if in agreement. The sound of the door opening pulled her from these reflections. Wesley entered in a swirl of cold air, his cheeks reddened from exertion, and his breath forming clouds in the cabin's warmth. "Path's clear," he announced, stomping snow from his boots. "Though we'll need to check the barn roof after yesterday's snowfall. It's holding for now, but that northwest corner looks concerning." Sarah nodded, appreciating both his foresight and the ease with which he had adopted "we" in discussing cabin maintenance. "I'll make coffee while you warm up. There's still cornbread from last night if you're hungry." Their domestic routine had developed naturally over the past weeks, each finding satisfaction in tasks that contributed to their shared comfort. Wesley built and maintained the fires, handled the increasingly heavy outdoor work, and had taken over the evening reading that Sarah found difficult as her eyesight sometimes blurred with pregnancy fatigue. Sarah managed their food supplies, prepared meals, and continued working on baby preparations now with Wesley's interested participation. "I've been thinking," Wesley said, as they sat at the small table sharing breakfast and planning the day ahead. "The baby will be here within weeks. We should discuss preparations more specifically." The practical approach was characteristic of him addressing potential challenges directly rather than avoiding difficult conversations. It was a quality Sarah had come to value highly. "What sort of preparations?" she asked, though she suspected she knew where the conversation was heading. "Medical assistance primarily." Wesley's expression was serious. "I understand that women here typically manage with experienced neighbors, but given your isolation and the winter conditions, that seems unnecessarily risky." Sarah sighed, having anticipated this concern. "The nearest midwife is in Cooper's Creek, 15 miles through snowblock passes. The roads won't be passable for weeks yet." "Then perhaps we should consider going to Cooper's Creek before the baby arrives," Wesley suggested. "Find lodging in town until after the birth." The proposal wasn't unreasonable, but it stirred unexpected resistance in Sarah. This cabin, for all its isolation and simplicity, represented security, a place where she controlled her circumstances and answered to no one's judgment. The thought of facing townspeople's curious stares and inevitable gossip about her condition in Wesley's presence made her profoundly uncomfortable. "I was born in this cabin," she said quietly, "as was my mother before me. I had always imagined my child would be born here too." Wesley studied her face, reading the deeper emotions beneath her words. "It's important to you continuing that tradition." "It is." She met his gaze directly, "More than I realized until this moment." He nodded slowly, accepting her feelings without dismissing them. "Then we prepare here as thoroughly as possible. What would you need to feel safe and comfortable for the birth?" The question, asked with such sincere concern, touched Sarah deeply. Thomas had never consulted her feelings or preferences. Decisions were announced rather than discussed, her role merely to accommodate his plans. Wesley's approach, seeking her input, valuing her wishes, represented a form of partnership she had previously experienced only with her parents. Clean linens, she began, mentally reviewing what a home birth would require. My mother's herbal preparations for pain and bleeding, hot water, of course, and she hesitated, then continued honestly, someone who won't panic if complications arise. "I won't panic," Wesley promised, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. "I've delivered foals and calves, admittedly, but the principles can't be entirely different." The comparison startled a laugh from her. "I'm not certain whether to be reassured or offended." His answering smile warmed his eyes. "Be reassured. Life coming into the world is always a miracle, whether animal or human, and I've never lost a delivery yet." The confidence in his voice, tempered with just enough humor to acknowledge the seriousness without increasing her anxiety, settled something in Sarah's chest. This was what partnership could be: facing challenges together with honesty and mutual support. "Very well," she agreed. "We'll prepare for the birth here. But if there's any sign of early trouble, we'll reconsider Cooper's Creek immediately," Wesley finished. "I promise." With that settled, they turned to practical preparations. Sarah directed Wesley in constructing a crude but functional birthing chair, similar to one her mother had used, positioning it near the fire where warmth and light would be optimal. Together, they inventoried her mother's herbal supplies, setting aside preparations specific to childbirth and postpartum recovery. Wesley surprised her with his retention of information from the remedy book, recalling which herbs aided with pain and which prevented excessive bleeding. The work kept them busy throughout the day, their shared purpose creating a sense of intimacy that transcended their relatively brief acquaintance. By evening, when they settled before the fire for their customary conversation, Sarah felt a contentment that had eluded her since Thomas's departure, perhaps even before. "Tell me about your sister," she said, working on the nearly completed baby blanket while Wesley read from her father's worn Bible. "You've mentioned your parents extensively, but Catherine only in passing." Wesley set the book aside, his expression softening with genuine affection. "Catherine is the best of the Holly family, all the determination and intelligence without the ruthless ambition. She's 22, educated far beyond what's typical for women in Texas, and utterly fearless about expressing opinions that scandalize my father's business associates." "She sounds formidable," Sarah observed, amused by his obvious pride. She is. Wesley leaned back in his chair, memories clearly playing across his features. When I was 12 and she was 6, she announced at a dinner party that she intended to become a doctor. My father laughed indulgently and said she'd change her mind when she found a suitable husband. 16 years later, she's completed nursing training and assists the family physician with the procedures that make grown men faint. Your father allowed this. Allowed isn't precisely the term, Wesley chuckled. Let's say he discovered that Holly's stubbornness isn't confined to the male line. Catherine simply proceeded with her plans, ignoring objections until they ceased from exhaustion. The description intrigued Sarah. You admire her greatly. I do. Wesley's voice grew thoughtful. She lives authentically without apology for who she is or what she values. It's a courage I've only recently begun to understand, let alone emulate. Something in his tone suggested deeper significance to these reflections. Sarah set aside her needlework, giving him her full attention. Is that what your journey north represents? An attempt to find that same authenticity? Partly what so, he acknowledged, though I can't claim Catherine's natural confidence. She always seemed to know exactly who she was, while I've spent 32 years trying to become someone I'm not. He met Sarah's gaze directly. Until recently. The implication hung between them that his time with her had clarified something essential about his identity and desires. Sarah felt her heart quicken, but restrained herself from reading too much into his words. Experience had taught her that emotional declarations often reflected temporary circumstances rather than lasting commitment. Your family must miss you, she said carefully, especially Catherine. They do, Wesley agreed, though Catherine at least understands why I left. He hesitated, then added more quietly, I've been thinking about writing to her actually, letting her know I'm safe if not my specific location. You should, Sarah encouraged. It would ease her worry without compromising your position. Perhaps. Wesley stared into the fire, his expression troubled. Though any communication risks interception by my father. Charles Holly has connections throughout the Western Territories, postal clerks, telegraph operators, railroad employees. Information is a commodity he trades as readily as cattle. The revelation offered another glimpse into the world Wesley had fled, one where power and influence extended far beyond ordinary understanding. Sarah wondered again at the courage it had taken to abandon such privilege and the determination required to remain separated from it. You truly believe he would track you here, she asked. I know he would given sufficient information. Wesley's certainty was sobering, not from paternal concern, but because I represent a significant investment of time and grooming. The Holly heir doesn't simply walk away from responsibilities without consequences. Sarah considered this her practical nature, assessing potential risks. Then perhaps a letter isn't wise, at least not yet. When spring arrives and travel becomes possible again, we can reconsider. Wesley nodded, accepting her counsel. The ease with which they discussed future plans, the natural inclusion of each other in those considerations, hadn't escaped either's notice. They were building something together, not just preparations for a birth, but foundations for what might follow. The realization both comforted and unsettled Sarah. Comfort came from the partnership they were developing based on mutual respect and genuine care. Unease stemmed from her lingering fear that such happiness might prove temporary, that Wesley would eventually return to his privileged world or find frontier life too demanding once its novelty faded. What are you thinking? Wesley asked, attuned to the subtle shifts in her expression. Sarah hesitated, reluctant to voice doubts that might seem ungrateful given his consistent support. Yet honesty had become the cornerstone of their relationship, and withholding her concerns felt like a betrayal of that foundation. I'm thinking about impermanence, she admitted finally, about how circumstances change, and with them sometimes people's commitments and priorities. Wesley's gaze sharpened, understanding the unspoken comparison to Thomas. You're worried that I'll leave when things become difficult. It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway, appreciating his directness. Not from ill intention, she clarified, but this life, she gestured around the cabin, indicating the simplicity and isolation of her existence, is vastly different from anything you've known. What seems novel and meaningful now might eventually feel confining. Wesley was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the thoughtfulness she'd come to expect from him. When he spoke, his voice carried conviction without defensiveness. "I understand your caution," he said, "and I won't insult you with promises that can't be verified except through time and testing." He leaned forward, his gaze steady on hers. "But I will tell you this. I've spent my entire life surrounded by luxury that brought no satisfaction, and the past month in this cabin has given me more genuine contentment than 32 years in Texas mansions." The sincerity in his eyes made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. Before she could respond, however, the baby delivered a particularly vigorous kick that made her gasp and press her hand to her side. Wesley was immediately beside her, concern evident in his expression. "Sarah, just an enthusiastic greeting from our little boxer," she reassured him, taking his hand and placing it where the baby continued to move. "Feel that I think she's practicing for a career in cattle driving." The wonder that transformed Wesley's face as he felt the child's movements beneath his palm created a moment of such intimate connection that Sarah found herself blinking back unexpected tears. Here was a man who had no biological claim to this child, yet his expression held more genuine tenderness than Thomas had ever shown at similar moments. "Hello there, little one," Wesley murmured, his voice soft with awe. "You're certainly making your presence known." The simple interaction, charged with emotion neither could fully articulate, shifted something fundamental between them. This wasn't merely two adults finding comfort in shared circumstances. It was the nascent formation of a family unit created not through conventional paths, but through conscious choice and genuine affection. When Wesley finally withdrew his hand and returned to his chair, the atmosphere in the cabin had altered subtly but significantly. Possibilities that had seemed remote or theoretical now felt immediate and concrete decisions, awaiting only their courage to embrace them. "When the baby comes," Sarah said carefully, "what do you envision happening next?" The question addressed directly what they had been circling for days. Wesley gave it the consideration it deserved, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed by its implications. "Ideally," he began, "I envision us continuing what we've begun here, building a life based on partnership and mutual respect. I know that's presumptuous given the brevity of our acquaintance, but—" "Is it brief?" Sarah interrupted gently. "These weeks have contained more genuine knowing than years of superficial interaction might provide." Wesley nodded, acknowledging the truth in her observation. "Even so, I understand you need more than declarations of feeling. You need practical assurances about the future, your future and your child's." "I do," Sarah confirmed. The baby had settled, but she kept her hand resting protectively over the spot where movement had been most vigorous. "Whatever happens between us, this child deserves stability and security." "Agreed." Wesley leaned forward, his posture conveying the seriousness with which he approached the discussion. "Which is why I've been considering possibilities for supporting a family here in Montana." The deliberate phrasing, "supporting a family," didn't escape Sarah's notice, nor did the practical direction of his thinking, which suggested he'd given considerable thought to their potential future together. "What possibilities?" she asked. "Several, depending on your preferences." Wesley's response revealed the business acumen beneath his recent adoption of manual skills. "This valley has good grazing land, suitable for a small cattle operation. Not the scale of the Holly Company, but enough to provide comfortable living with proper management." Sarah nodded, familiar with the territory's potential. "My father considered cattle before settling on mixed farming. The initial investment is substantial, though." "I have resources," Wesley said simply. "Before leaving Texas, I liquidated personal investments my father couldn't access. Not a fortune, but sufficient to establish a modest ranch." The revelation surprised Sarah. She'd assumed his flight had been impulsive, driven by immediate circumstances rather than carefully planned. This evidence of forethought suggested his decision to abandon his former life had roots deeper than rebellion against an arranged marriage. "Alternatively," Wesley continued, "Cooper's Creek is growing. The railroad spur will reach it by year's end, according to reports. The town will need professional services, legal counsel, property management, investment, guidance, areas where my education and experience could prove valuable." His methodical presentation of options, devoid of pressured expectations or emotional manipulation, impressed Sarah deeply. This wasn't a man offering grand, unsustainable promises. This was someone who understood that love, however genuine, required practical foundations to flourish. "You've given this considerable thought," she observed. "I have." Wesley's direct gaze held hers, because what's developing between us matters enough to warrant serious consideration of how it might succeed long-term. The simple statement, delivered without dramatic flourish, touched Sarah more profoundly than elaborate declarations might have. Here was honesty without artifice, commitment without pressure, possibilities, presented for joint consideration rather than imposed unilaterally. Before she could respond, however, a sound from outside interrupted their conversation, the distant but unmistakable jingle of harness bells suggesting approaching travelers. In the isolated valley during winter, such an occurrence was so unusual that both immediately tensed with alarm. Wesley moved to the window, peering through the gathering dusk. "A sleigh," he reported, his voice tight with concern. "Two riders alongside. Still some distance away, but definitely approaching the cabin." Sarah rose as quickly as her condition allowed, instinctively moving toward the rifle mounted above the door, a precaution her father had insisted upon for a woman living alone in the territories. "Neighbors wouldn't travel at this hour without emergency," she said, "and strangers rarely mean well, especially in winter." Wesley nodded grimly, already reaching for his coat. "I'll check that the barn is secure. Make sure your animals are quiet. If they're searching, best not to advertise all our locations immediately." The practiced efficiency with which he assessed potential threats and moved to address them revealed another dimension to Wesley's character. The protective instinct and strategic thinking that had likely been cultivated through his upbringing in a prominent family subject to various forms of targeting. "Be careful," Sarah cautioned, as he prepared to slip outside. "If they're hostile, the cabin is more defensible than the barn." "I'll return before they arrive," he assured her. "Just basic precautions for now." Left alone, Sarah quickly assessed their situation. The cabin was well stocked with provisions, the water barrel full, firewood plentiful near the hearth. If necessary, they could withstand a siege of several days without venturing outside. The rifle was loaded, and she kept additional ammunition in a box beneath her bed, another of her father's prudent preparations. More concerning was her advanced pregnancy. If these visitors proved threatening, any resulting stress or confrontation could potentially trigger early labor, a complication she desperately wished to avoid, particularly with unknown individuals nearby. Wesley returned within minutes, his breath coming in white clouds as he secured the door behind him. "Animals are settled. Barn appears ordinary from outside," he reported. "The sleigh is still approaching, moving slowly due to snow depth. We have perhaps 10 minutes before they arrive." "Did you recognize anything about them markings on the sleigh clothing style?" Wesley shook his head. "Too distant for details. But the sleigh is well made, the horses quality stock. Not ordinary travelers or local farmers." This assessment increased Sarah's unease. Well-equipped strangers in this remote location during winter suggested purpose rather than chance, and given Wesley's circumstances, that purpose might well involve his return to Texas, willing or otherwise. "Could your father have found you?" she asked directly, voicing the fear they both harbored. "Possibly." Wesley's expression tightened. "Though I took significant precautions to obscure my trail. More likely it's someone from Cooper's Creek, perhaps with news or official business." Neither fully believed this optimistic interpretation, but it provided temporary comfort as they prepared to meet whatever approached. Wesley positioned himself near the window where he could observe the visitors' arrival while remaining partially concealed. Sarah busied herself with ordinary evening tasks, stoking the fire, preparing the kettle, actions that might suggest normal routine rather than anxious anticipation. The minutes passed with excruciating slowness, measured by the steady tick of her father's old clock and the gradually increasing sound of bells and horses' hooves. Finally, Wesley straightened his posture, conveying surprise rather than alarm. "It's a woman," he said, incredulity evident in his tone. "Older, expensively dressed, two men accompanying employees or guards from their position and demeanor." Sarah joined him at the window, peering past his shoulder at the approaching party. The sleigh had almost reached the cabin, clearing an elegant conveyance with polished wood and brass fittings pulled by two matched gray horses, whose quality was evident even to her untrained eye. The woman seated inside was wrapped in what appeared to be fine furs, her silver hair visible beneath a stylish hat. "Do you recognize her?" Sarah asked, noting the tension in Wesley's shoulders. He nodded once, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief and apprehension. "My Aunt Margaret," he said quietly. "My father's sister." The revelation landed with surprising weight. Of all possible visitors, family members represented the most complicated potential encounter, particularly for Wesley, whose escape from familial expectations had defined his recent choices. Is she aligned with your father's views? Sarah asked carefully. Not entirely. Wesley's voice held uncertainty. Margaret has always been the family maverick, unmarried by choice, manages her own considerable holdings independently. She and my father disagreed on many things, but they maintain relations for family harmony. This description offered limited reassurance. Whether ally or adversary, Margaret Holly's arrival represented the first direct connection to Wesley's past life, a bridge between the isolated existence they'd been sharing and the complex social world he'd abandoned. What should we do? Sarah asked, practical concerns overriding emotional reactions. Wesley took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders with the composure of someone accustomed to difficult social negotiations. We receive her with courtesy, he decided. Learn her purpose before revealing anything of our situation. The slight hesitation before situation reminded Sarah of how undefined their relationship remained, how recent and potentially fragile their connection might appear to outsiders, particularly those from Wesley's privileged background. Would this elegant woman from Texas see anything in Sarah Ellison beyond a pregnant frontier widow who had entangled her nephew in inappropriate circumstances? The sleigh had reached the clearing before the cabin, coming to a stop approximately 20 yards from the door. One of the accompanying men immediately dismounted to assist the woman, while the other remained vigilantly mounted, surveying the surroundings with professional attention that suggested protective training rather than casual companionship. She's traveled a considerable distance to find you, Sarah observed. That suggests significant purpose. Wesley nodded grimly. Margaret never acts without thorough consideration. Whatever brings her here, it's no casual visit. The woman was approaching the cabin, now moving with remarkable grace through the snow despite her age and formal attire. Up close, Sarah could see distinctive features that confirmed her relation to Wesley, the same determined set to the jaw, the same directness of gaze. Here was someone accustomed to command, whose expectations of obedience came not from volume or intimidation, but from absolute self-assurance. Wesley opened the door before she could knock, stepping onto the small porch to greet her. Aunt Margaret, he said, his voice carefully controlled. This is unexpected. Wesley. Her voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern education overlaid with subtle Texas warmth. You've led us on quite a chase, young man. Her gaze moved past him to Sarah, who had positioned herself in the doorway close enough to demonstrate support, yet not so near as to presume a relationship that might complicate the already tense situation. Margaret's assessment was quick but thorough, taking in Sarah's advanced pregnancy, simple clothing, and the cabin's modest but well-maintained appearance. Mrs. Ellison, I presume, she said, surprising both with her knowledge of Sarah's name. I hope you'll forgive this intrusion. I've traveled a considerable distance to speak with my nephew on matters of some urgency. The polite acknowledgement, devoid of either condescension or excessive warmth, suggested a woman who reserved judgment until she had gathered sufficient information, a trait Sarah could respect, regardless of other potential differences between them. You're welcome to shelter here, Miss Holly, Sarah replied with equal formality. The weather isn't suitable for extended conversation outdoors. Margaret's expression registered approval at this practical response. With a gesture to her attendants indicating they should remain with the horses, she followed Wesley into the cabin, removing her gloves but retaining her hat and coat, suggesting she anticipated a brief rather than extended visit. Inside, the cabin's single room suddenly seemed smaller than it had moments before, the simple furnishings and rustic construction thrown into sharp relief by Margaret's elegant presence. Yet the older woman showed no reaction to these humble surroundings, taking the offered chair with the same composure she might have demonstrated in a formal parlor. I'll prepare coffee, Sarah said, sensing the Hollies needed a moment of privacy for initial exchanges. The practical task would allow her to remain present while giving them nominal space for family matters. Thank you, Mrs. Ellison, Margaret said, then turned her full attention to Wesley, who had positioned himself opposite her, his posture reflecting both defensive caution and genuine concern. How did you find me? He asked without preamble. Margaret's slight smile acknowledged his directness. You covered your tracks admirably from most observers, she conceded. Unfortunately for your purposes, I maintain connections with transport companies throughout the territory's benefits of shipping, prize cattle for breeding. A Holly asking questions about northbound routes attracts attention even when using a different name. Wesley absorbed this information with a grimace. You've told my father. That depends entirely on our conversation today. Margaret removed her hat, revealing silver hair, arranged in a practical yet elegant style. I've made no report to Charles about your whereabouts, nor do I intend to without compelling reason. The conditional nature of this statement did little to ease the tension in Wesley's shoulders. What constitutes compelling reason in your estimation? Evidence that you're acting from childish rebellion rather than genuine conviction, she replied promptly. I've supported your independent thinking since childhood, Wesley, often against your father's more rigid expectations. But disappearing weeks before a wedding that involves multiple families and significant business interests requires more justification than romantic notions about marrying for love. The blunt assessment, delivered without emotional manipulation, but with clear expectations of mature response, revealed much about Margaret Holly's character in her relationship with her nephew. This was someone who balanced family loyalty with personal principles, who might become ally or adversary, depending on Wesley's ability to articulate his choices convincingly. It wasn't rebellion, Wesley said carefully. It was self-preservation. Margaret's eyebrow rose slightly, inviting elaboration without interrupting his thoughts. The merger with the Whitmans represents everything I've come to reject about our family's approach to relationships. Wesley continued, his voice gathering conviction as he spoke. Treating people as assets, measuring worth through financial contribution, sacrificing personal happiness for corporate advantage. Business arrangements have sustained the Holly empire for 2 generations. Margaret observed, though her tone suggested consideration rather than dismissal of his perspective. At what cost? Wesley countered. My father's marriage to my mother has produced heirs and expanded holdings, but I've never once heard either express genuine joy in each other's company. Is that the legacy we're protecting? Profitable misery passed from one generation to the next. The passionate response seemed to satisfy something in Margaret's assessment. She nodded slightly, her expression softening. You sound like your grandfather, she said. Jonathan Holly was equally stubborn about principles that defied conventional wisdom. This comparison appeared to surprise Wesley. Father always describes grandfather as the ultimate pragmatist, making difficult decisions that established our family's position. Your father, Margaret said dryly, selectively remembers the aspects of family history that support his worldview. Jonathan married my mother against significant opposition, refusing multiple advantageous matches because he valued her intelligence and character above social connections. This revelation clearly startled Wesley, who glanced towards Sarah with newfound understanding. The parallel between his grandfather's choices and his current situation wasn't lost on either of them, though both refrained from drawing explicit attention to the connection in Margaret's presence. Why hasn't Father ever mentioned this? Wesley asked. Because it contradicts the narrative he's constructed about family obligation. Margaret accepted the coffee Sarah offered with a gracious nod. Charles believes his approach to business and relationships represents Holly tradition. In reality, he's departed significantly from your grandfather's balance between material success and personal fulfillment. This glimpse into family history previously unknown to Wesley created a subtle but important shift in the cabin's atmosphere. What had begun as potential confrontation had transformed into a more nuanced exchange about legacy and personal choice territory, where Margaret appeared more ally than adversary. Sarah, returning to her chair after serving coffee, found herself included in Margaret's next comment. Mrs. Ellison, I hope you'll forgive family matters dominating the conversation. I understand from local sources that you've shown my nephew considerable kindness during difficult circumstances. The acknowledgement contained neither accusation nor excessive gratitude, simply recognition of facts without presuming the nature of their relationship. Sarah appreciated the older woman's tact, recognizing in it the same directness tempered with consideration that characterized Wesley's approach to difficult topics. Mr. Holly arrived during a blizzard, Sarah replied evenly. Anyone would have offered shelter. Margaret's slight smile suggested she recognized the deliberate understatement. Perhaps, though not everyone would have maintained that hospitality through weeks of winter isolation, particularly in your condition. Her gaze moved briefly to Sarah's prominent belly before returning to her face with what appeared to be genuine respect. I understand your husband is absent, The question, though potentially intrusive, was presented with such straightforward inquiry that Sarah found herself answering honestly. My fiancé left for Denver several months ago. He has not returned nor sent word. She delivered this information without self-pity or defensive explanation, a simple statement of circumstances that had shaped her recent choices. Margaret received it with a thoughtful nod, her expression revealing neither judgment nor excessive sympathy. I see. Her gaze moved between Sarah and Wesley, assessing with experienced eyes the nature of the connection that had formed between them. Then perhaps my nephew's arrival, however unplanned, has provided mutual benefit during difficult times. The diplomatic phrasing acknowledged their situation without forcing premature definitions or commitments. Wesley visibly relaxed at this evidence of his aunt's understanding, though caution remained in his posture. Margaret, he said, using her first name for the first time since her arrival, you still haven't explained why you've tracked me to Montana. If not to report my location to Father, so then what purpose brings you here personally? Rather than sending correspondence, the direct question seemed to please rather than offend her. Margaret set her coffee cup aside, assuming the posture of someone delivering significant information that required full attention. Two developments you should be aware of before making permanent decisions about your future, she said. First, Eleanor Whitman has married Harrison Caldwell, son of the railroad commissioner. A rather hasty ceremony conducted 3 weeks ago with minimal social announcement. Wesley's expression registered shock. Eleanor and Harrison, but Father always dismissed the Caldwells as new money without proper breeding, his words not mine. Indeed, Margaret confirmed with dry amusement, which makes the alliance particularly galling to him, especially given the Railroad Commission's influence over cattle shipping rates. So the merger, Wesley began. It's entirely collapsed, Margaret finished. James Whitman withdrew all pending agreements the day after the wedding announcement. Your father is, she paused, selecting her words carefully, adjusting to these altered circumstances. The revelation landed with significant impact. The arranged marriage that had precipitated Wesley's flight was no longer viable, a development that fundamentally changed the landscape of choices before him. He could potentially return to Texas without facing immediate pressure to fulfill that particular family expectation. Sarah felt her heart constrict at the possibility, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. Wesley had never definitively stated he would remain in Montana permanently. Their discussions of future possibilities had always contained implicit conditions and unspoken questions. With this primary obstacle to his return removed, would his emerging feelings for her prove sufficient counterweight to the pull of wealth position and family connection? The second development, Wesley asked, his voice carefully controlled as he processed this initial revelation. Margaret's expression grew more serious. Your father's health has deteriorated significantly since your departure. The physician believes it's his heart weakened by decades of driving ambition and recent stress. This news struck Wesley visibly harder than the first announcement. Whatever complications existed in his relationship with Charles Holly, genuine concern for his father's well-being was immediately evident in his reaction. How serious? He asked quietly. Serious enough for legitimate concern, though not immediate crisis, Margaret replied. He continues working against medical advice, but has been forced to reduce his schedule considerably. Wesley rose from his chair, moving to the window where he stood silently for several moments, conflict evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. Sarah understood without words the competing emotions this news must have triggered: concern for his father's health, warring with reluctance to be manipulated by what might be exaggerated reports designed to secure his return. Why are you telling me this? He asked, finally turning back to face his aunt. You could have simply reported my location to Father, allowed him to send representatives to retrieve his wayward son. Margaret regarded him steadily. Because I believe in informed choice, Wesley. Your father and I disagree on many things, but primarily on whether adults should determine their own paths or follow directions established by others. I have no intention of dragging you back to Texas against your will. Your life is your own to direct. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, as was the implicit challenge beneath her words. She was offering information without pressure, but with clear expectation that he would use it to make thoughtful decisions rather than reactive ones. I appreciate your directness, Wesley acknowledged, and your respect for my autonomy. You've earned both, Margaret replied simply. The question now becomes what you intend to do with this information. The cabin fell silent as the weight of pending decisions settled over its occupants. Outside, the short winter day was fading toward dusk, the temperature dropping with the sun's descent. Inside, three people faced a crossroads that would shape at least two futures, possibly three, counting the unborn child whose arrival grew nearer with each passing day. I need time to consider, Wesley said finally. These developments change circumstances significantly, but not necessarily my fundamental concerns about returning to the life I left. Margaret nodded, accepting this measured response. Reasonable, she agreed, though I should note that I've reserved accommodations in Cooper's Creek for 3 days only. My business interests require my return to Texas by month's end, with or without your decision. The gentle pressure of a deadline applied without manipulation but with practical necessity was characteristic of her approach thus far, respecting Wesley's agency while acknowledging real-world constraints. "Where are you staying in Cooper's Creek?" Sarah asked, breaking her silence on these family matters for the first time. "The Western Hotel," Margaret replied. "Recently expanded, I understand, and moderately comfortable by territorial standards." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "The Andrews family owns it. Good people, fair prices." She hesitated, then added with frontier hospitality that transcended her personal uncertainty about the situation. "The roads to town are difficult after dark. You're welcome to shelter here tonight if you prefer." The offer extended despite the complications Margaret's presence created for their evolving relationship. It demonstrated the generosity of spirit that had drawn Wesley to Sarah initially. His grateful glance acknowledged both the practical kindness and the emotional maturity behind it. Margaret, however, shook her head with a small smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellison, but my driver knows these roads well, and we've come prepared for night travel. Besides," she added with surprising perceptiveness, "I suspect you and my nephew have considerable matters to discuss privately, given today's revelations." The tactful acknowledgement of their need for unobserved conversation confirmed Sarah's growing impression of Margaret Holly as someone whose formidable exterior concealed genuine empathy and social intelligence. Whatever her personal assessment of the situation between her nephew and a pregnant frontier widow, she was neither interfering nor judgmental, qualities rare enough in family members of any social standing. "I'll return to Cooper's Creek then," Margaret said, rising and replacing her hat with practiced movements. "Wesley, I'll expect communication from you within 3 days, whatever your decision." Wesley moved to assist her with her coat, the ingrained courtesy of his upbringing, automatic despite the emotional complexity of their exchange. "Thank you, Margaret," he said quietly, "for coming personally and for allowing me space to determine my own response." "You're welcome." She paused at the door, her expression softening slightly. "Whatever you decide, Wesley, choose from conviction rather than rebellion or obligation. Either path, returning to Texas or establishing something new here, deserves wholehearted commitment rather than reluctant compromise." With that parting counsel delivered with evident sincerity, Margaret Holly departed the cabin as composed as she had entered it. Through the window, Sarah and Wesley watched her return to the waiting sleigh, her attendants assisting her with practiced efficiency before setting the conveyance in motion toward Cooper's Creek. As the sound of bells faded into the distance, the cabin seemed to expand around them, the absence of Margaret's commanding presence creating space for the magnitude of decisions now facing them. Wesley remained at the window long after the sleigh had disappeared from view, his expression revealing the internal struggle between competing responsibilities and desires. Sarah moved quietly around the cabin, tending the fire and beginning simple preparations for their evening meal, practical tasks that provided structure while allowing Wesley necessary space for reflection. When he finally turned from the window, his face held both uncertainty and resolution, a combination that suggested he had reached preliminary but not final conclusions. "I owe you an explanation," he began. "You owe me nothing," Sarah countered gently. "Your family matters are your own." "No," Wesley shook his head, moving to stand before her. "What happens next affects us both, you, me, and this child. We've been building something here, Sarah, something I value more than I can adequately express. Margaret's news changes external circumstances, but it doesn't alter what's grown between us." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply, yet caution born from previous disappointment held her response measured. "Eleanor's marriage removes the immediate pressure for your return," she acknowledged. But your father's health creates new obligations that might prove equally compelling. Wesley nodded, accepting the complexity she outlined. Yes, and I won't pretend those considerations aren't significant. My father, whatever our differences, remains family. His condition deserves my attention, particularly if— He hesitated, then continued honestly, if it's as serious as Margaret suggests. Of course, Sarah agreed, recognizing the genuine concern beneath his words. No matter how complicated his relationship with Charles Holly, abandoning a potentially ill parent would violate Wesley's fundamental character as she had come to understand it. But that doesn't mean abandoning what we've begun. Wesley continued, reaching to take her hands in his. Sarah, these weeks with you have shown me possibilities I never imagined in Texas partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than convenience or advantage. The warmth of his touch matched the sincerity in his eyes, yet Sarah maintained her measured response, needing absolute clarity before allowing herself to fully embrace hope. What are you saying, Wesley? I'm saying, he replied, his voice steady with conviction, that whatever decisions lie ahead, they should be made together with consideration for both our futures and the child's. I'm saying that returning to Texas, if necessary, doesn't mean returning to the life I left or leaving behind the one we might build together. The implication of his words that their relationship had significance beyond temporary arrangement created both joy and apprehension in Sarah's heart. Joy at the confirmation of feelings she had increasingly harbored, apprehension at the practical challenges such feelings might face when confronted with the realities of their different backgrounds and circumstances. Your family, she began, then corrected herself. Some members of your family might not welcome a pregnant widow without social standing or financial resources. Perhaps not initially, Wesley acknowledged candidly, but Margaret's reaction today suggests more openness than I might have expected. And ultimately, it's my life to direct, as she so pointedly reminded me. His confidence was reassuring, yet Sarah had experienced too many broken promises to accept easy assurances without practical consideration. These are significant decisions, Wesley, with long-term consequences for all involved. They shouldn't be made hastily or under emotional pressure. Wesley nodded, respecting her caution rather than dismissing it. Agreed. Which is why I propose that we take these next days to consider all possibilities thoroughly together. Margaret's deadline provides structure without forcing immediate conclusions. The reasonable approach, balancing emotional connection with practical assessment, confirmed again why Sarah had grown to trust Wesley's judgment. Unlike Thomas, whose decisions had been impulsive and self-serving, Wesley demonstrated consistent thoughtfulness about their shared welfare. Very well, she agreed, squeezing his hands gently before releasing them to continue her meal preparations. 3 days of consideration with honesty about both feelings and practical concerns. Wesley accepted this measured response with evident relief, understanding that her caution represented wisdom rather than rejection. As they moved through their evening routine, sharing dinner, discussing the day's events, settling before the fire for their customary conversation, a new layer of significance infused these familiar activities. Each now carried weight as potential template for a shared future, whether in Montana's wilderness or Texas's more civilized territory. Later, as Sarah prepared for sleep, she found Wesley standing again at the window, his expression contemplative as he studied the star-filled sky above the snow-covered valley. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. He turned, the moonlight illuminating features that had grown dear to her over these weeks of shared isolation. "I'm thinking that choices are rarely as binary as they first appear," he said. "Montana or Texas, family obligation or personal freedom, past or future. Perhaps the path forward contains elements of each, rather than exclusive selection." And the insight revealed the depth of his reflection, considering nuanced possibilities rather than stark alternatives. It was this quality, the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to broader patterns and potential compromises, that had increasingly earned Sarah's respect, and though she hesitated to name it fully, even to herself, her love. "Whatever path emerges," she said quietly, "we'll face it with clear eyes and honest hearts." Wesley's smile held both tenderness and determination, an expression she had come to recognize as uniquely his, reflecting both the privileged education that had shaped his mind and the frontier experiences that had recently tested his character. Together, he affirmed the single word carrying promise without pressuring commitment. As Sarah settled into her bed, the baby moving restlessly within her, as if sensing the emotional currents in the cabin, she allowed herself cautious hope for the first time since Thomas's abandonment. Whatever decisions the coming days might bring, she was no longer facing them alone, and the partnership forming between herself and Wesley Holly offered possibilities far richer than mere survival. Outside, the Montana winter continued its patient reign over the landscape, stars glittering with cold brilliance above the silent valley. Inside, two people whose lives had intersected through chance now contemplated joining those lives through choice, aware of the challenges such a decision would entail, but increasingly convinced of its potential rewards. 3 days to determine their course. 3 days that would shape three lives. The 3 days following Margaret Holly's unexpected visit passed with a strange mixture of ordinary routine and extraordinary consideration. Sarah and Wesley maintained their established patterns, tending animals, preparing meals, managing the cabin's needs, while simultaneously engaging in the most significant discussions of their lives. These conversations occurred in fragments throughout their days, sometimes sparked by practical concerns, other times by philosophical questions about family obligation and the nature of genuine partnership. Unlike the hasty promises and superficial assurances that had characterized Sarah's relationship with Thomas, these exchanges were measured, thoughtful, and unflinchingly honest about both possibilities and potential challenges. "If I return to Texas," Wesley said on the morning after Margaret's departure, his hands busy repairing a loose chair rung, "it wouldn't be to resume my former position or accept my father's expectations. It would be to address family matters directly, then establish independent arrangements." Sarah nodded, kneading bread dough with practiced movements. "What form might those arrangements take?" "I own property separately from the main Holly Holdings land, inherited from my maternal grandfather that my father can't control. Modest by Holly standards, but substantial enough to support a family comfortably." He glanced up, meeting her gaze directly. "It would provide a base from which to build something that's ours, rather than merely an extension of existing operations." The careful distinction between inherited empire and personally created establishment reflected Wesley's evolving perspective on meaningful work and genuine accomplishment. Sarah recognized in it the values her own parents had embodied: pride in building, rather than merely receiving satisfaction, and personal effort, rather than delegated achievement. "And if you remain in Montana," she asked, equally direct. "Then we face different challenges but similar principles," Wesley replied. "Establishing something sustainable requires investment, financial and personal. I have resources for the former. The latter we've already begun together." This balanced assessment of both options, presented without pressure for immediate decision, allowed Sarah space to voice her own concerns and preferences. Over meals and evening conversations, she articulated questions that Thomas had never bothered to address about child-rearing approaches, economic expectations, and the practical distribution of responsibilities that define successful partnerships. "My mother managed our household accounts," she explained one evening. "Father earned through farming and occasional carpentry, but mother determined how resources were allocated. It was partnership rather than patriarchy." Wesley considered this with genuine interest. "My parents operated differently, separate spheres with minimal consultation. Father controlled business matters entirely. Mother managed social obligations and charitable work with similar autonomy." "And which model seems healthier to you?" Sarah asked, testing his reflections rather than seeking agreement. "Yours, unquestionably," Wesley replied without hesitation. "The separation in my parents' approach created parallel lives rather than shared existence. They occupied the same spaces without truly inhabiting the same world." Such conversations revealed profound compatibility in their fundamental values despite vastly different backgrounds. Both valued authenticity over appearance, substance over status, and genuine connection over social advantage, priorities that transcended the circumstances of their upbringings and suggested potential for lasting alignment. On the afternoon of the third day, with Margaret's deadline approaching, Wesley stood at the window watching fresh snow descend in lazy spirals. Tomorrow he would need to travel to Cooper's Creek, either to accompany his aunt back to Texas or to inform her he was remaining in Montana. The decision, discussed thoroughly from every angle, now awaited only final articulation. "I've written 2 letters," he said, turning from the window to face Sarah, who sat darning socks near the fire. One to my father explaining my decision to remain in Montana and establish an independent life here. The other to Catherine asking her to monitor father's health and provide honest assessments rather than family-filtered reports. Sarah set aside her mending, giving him her full attention. You've decided then. We've decided, Wesley corrected gently, unless our conversations have led you to different conclusions than those we've been building toward. The careful phrasing acknowledging joint consideration while respecting her individual agency typified the approach that had increasingly earned Sarah's trust. Unlike Thomas, who had announced decisions as accomplished facts, Wesley consistently treated her as equal partner in deliberations that affected their shared future. I believe we've been moving toward the same conclusion. She agreed, her voice steady despite the emotional significance of the moment. Building something here together offers the best prospect for genuine partnership and meaningful life. Wesley crossed the room to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. The position, reminiscent of traditional proposal posture, carried weight beyond mere physical proximity. Sarah Ellison, he said, his voice carrying both conviction and question. Will you consider joining your life with mine, not from necessity or circumstance, but from choice and shared purpose? The formal language, deliberate rather than impulsive, acknowledged the seriousness with which he approached this commitment. This wasn't passionate declaration born of temporary emotion. It was considered offer based on genuine knowledge and mutual respect. Sarah looked into his eyes, finding there the steady dependability and thoughtful consideration she had come to value above more fleeting qualities. I will, she answered simply. Not because you represent security or solution to difficulty, but because together we've discovered something worth building upon. The exchange, lacking elaborate promises or dramatic flourishes, nevertheless carried profound significance for both. This was no hasty engagement founded on superficial attraction or practical convenience. It was carefully considered partnership between two people who had seen each other in their most vulnerable and most capable. Wesley leaned forward, his kiss gentle, yet filled with quiet certainty. When they separated, his expression held both joy and solemn recognition of responsibilities accepted. I'll travel to Cooper's Creek tomorrow, he said. Explain our decision to Margaret and make arrangements for necessary supplies. With proper preparations, we can begin establishing our future when spring arrives. Sarah nodded, practical considerations already forming in her mind. The baby will come before then, and she reminded him. Our first task will be navigating those early weeks together. The most important task. Wesley agreed, his hand moving to rest gently on her rounded belly. Everything else follows from that foundation. The baby kicked against his palm as if offering endorsement of their plans. The simple moment, two adults and an unborn child connected through touch and shared future, crystallized everything they had been building toward since Wesley's arrival during the blizzard. Family formed not through obligation or accident, but through conscious choice and genuine affection. Morning brought clear skies and temperatures cold enough to create a crystalline crust on the snow-ideal conditions for Wesley's journey to Cooper's Creek. Sarah packed provisions for his day-long ride, including extra clothing and emergency supplies should weather change unexpectedly. I've written to Mrs. Anderson, she said, handing him a sealed letter along with the food bundle. Their farm is halfway to town. If you deliver this, she'll likely insist you warm yourself before continuing. Billy could also accompany you for the remainder of the journey if the trail seems challenging. The practical consideration, thinking through potential difficulties and arranging reasonable precautions, demonstrated both her frontier experience and genuine concern for his safety. Wesley accepted the letter with appreciation for both. I'll be careful, he promised, and I'll return tomorrow, weather permitting. If conditions worsen, I'll remain in town rather than risk difficult travel. Good. Sarah adjusted his scarf with unconscious domesticity. Margaret will understand if snow delays your meeting. Safety before schedules. Wesley captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm with unexpected tenderness. 3 years with the Holly Cattle Company taught me to respect Montana winters. I have no intention of repeating my first experience with its dangers. The reference to his near freezing outside her cabin, the crisis that had brought them together, carried weight beyond the immediate conversation. Both recognized how circumstance and choice had intertwined to create their current path, neither pure accident nor entirely planned design. Their parting held the quiet confidence of people who expected reunion rather than the desperate intensity of uncertain separation. Wesley mounted his horse, the same mare that had carried him through the blizzard months earlier, and turned toward Cooper's Creek, his figure gradually diminishing against the vast white landscape. Sarah watched until he disappeared beyond the ridge, one hand resting protectively over her belly as the baby shifted within her. "He'll return," she told her unborn child, a statement carrying conviction born of genuine trust rather than wishful thinking. Unlike your father, Wesley Hawley keeps his promises. Alone in the cabin for the first time in weeks, Sarah found herself contemplating the profound changes that had reshaped her expectations since December's blizzard. What had begun as rescue of a stranger had evolved into partnership that promised deeper fulfillment than any she had previously imagined possible. The cabin, once a place of isolation and anxiety about the future, now felt like temporary shelter on the path towards something deliberately constructed and genuinely shared. She busied herself with practical tasks, inventory of remaining supplies, preparation of materials for the baby's imminent arrival, completion of the wedding blanket her mother had begun years earlier. Each activity now carried dual purpose, meeting immediate needs, while laying groundwork for the shared future she and Wesley had chosen to build together. By mid-afternoon, however, Sarah found herself experiencing increasing discomfort, not the occasional twinges that had become familiar in recent weeks, but more concentrated pressure that suggested the baby might be preparing for arrival sooner than anticipated. She paused in her work, focusing on her body's signals with experienced attention. "Not yet, little one," she murmured, rubbing gentle circles over the spot where movement was most pronounced. "Your father should be here to welcome you properly." The thought gave her pause, not because it was inaccurate, but because it had formed so naturally. In her mind, Wesley had indeed become this child's father, not through biology, but through choice and genuine care. The realization deepened her confidence in their decision to build a life together, confirming that their connection transcended conventional circumstances. As evening approached, the discomfort increased rather than subsiding. Sarah recognized the pattern from descriptions shared by her mother and other frontier women: early labor beginning with gradually intensifying pressure rather than sudden dramatic onset. She moved methodically through necessary preparations, arranging clean linens near the bed, positioning the birthing chair Wesley had constructed, ensuring water was heating on the stove. "Typical timing," she told the baby with rueful affection, "choosing the one day your father is absent to begin your arrival." The use of father felt increasingly natural, an acknowledgement of Wesley's role that transcended conventional definitions. This child would know a father's love and guidance regardless of biological connection, a gift Sarah had feared might be permanently lost when Thomas abandoned them. Night fell with increasing snow, transforming the landscape into shadowed white expanse beneath clouded sky. Sarah maintained the fire at higher intensity than usual, anticipating the need for extra warmth as labor progressed. The contractions, still widely spaced but gradually strengthening, confirmed her assessment that delivery remained hours away, likely tomorrow, which meant Wesley might return in time if weather permitted travel. She managed to sleep intermittently between contractions, conserving strength for the more demanding stages ahead. Dreams mixed with conscious thoughts, creating tapestry of past and future. Her parents' loving partnership, John's quiet steadiness, Thomas's abandonment, and now Wesley's promising presence. Each relationship had shaped her understanding of what partnership could mean, culminating in the carefully considered commitment she and Wesley had formed through weeks of shared experience. Morning arrived with steady snowfall that transformed overnight accumulation into significant barrier to travel. Sarah, moving carefully between increasingly demanding contractions, assessed the conditions with experienced eye. Wesley would not attempt return journey in such weather. He would remain in Cooper's Creek until conditions improved, unaware that his child had chosen this particular moment to begin arrival. "Just you and me then, little one," she told her belly, as another contraction built and released. "We've managed everything else together. We'll manage this too." The practical self-sufficiency that had sustained her through months of isolation remained foundation for her approach now. She had prepared, thoroughly possessed necessary knowledge, and maintained the calm determination that frontier life demanded of its women. The baby would come whether circumstances were ideal or challenging, Her task was simply to navigate the process as efficiently as possible. By mid-morning, labor had progressed to regular contractions, approximately 20 minutes apart, still early stages, but unmistakable in their purpose. Sarah alternated between walking slowly around the cabin when discomfort permitted and resting in the rocking chair during more intense episodes. She sipped herbal tea prepared according to her mother's recipe, ate small amounts of bread to maintain strength, and focused on her breathing as each wave of pressure peaked and subsided. The hours passed with the particular timelessness that intense physical experiences often create moments stretching into seeming eternity during contractions, then condensing into brief interludes of relative comfort between them. Sarah lost track of specific time measuring progression instead through her body's increasingly insistent signals that birth approached. When contractions reached approximately 10 minutes apart, she arranged final preparations, positioning fresh linens on the bed, ensuring clean cloths were within reach, checking that water remained hot on the stove. Each task required increasing concentration as her body's demands intensified, but the practical focus helped manage the discomfort and maintain necessary calm. "You're determined to arrive on your own schedule," she told the baby during a brief respite between contractions. "Strong-willed already, you'll need that quality in this world." The one-sided conversation provided comfort, creating sense of connection rather than isolation despite being physically alone. Sarah had always possessed the particular frontier strength that enabled survival through self-reliance, but she found herself wishing for Wesley's steady presence nonetheless, not from inability to manage independently, but from desire to share this profound experience with the partner she had chosen. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the contractions intensified and intervals shortened to approximately 5 minutes, entering active labor that demanded her complete attention. Sarah positioned herself on the birthing chair during the strongest waves, then moved to walk or rest between them as her body directed. The cabin became her entire world, external conditions fading to background awareness as the primal process of birth claimed her focus. "Soon," she murmured during one particularly powerful contraction, breathing through the intensity with practiced rhythm. "Soon we'll meet properly, little one." The sound of approaching horses barely registered through her concentration, dismissed initially as imagination or wind-distorted natural sounds. Only when knocking at the door penetrated her labor-focused awareness did Sarah realize someone had actually arrived, unexpected visitors during the worst possible circumstances. "Who," she began, interrupted by another contraction that forced her to grip the back of a chair for support. The door opened without waiting for response, unusual breach of frontier etiquette that suggested urgency. Margaret Holly entered first, removing snow-covered gloves with efficient movements, followed immediately by a younger woman whose practical traveling clothes and alert assessment of the cabin's interior suggested professional rather than social purpose. "Mrs. Ellison," Margaret acknowledged, taking in the situation with experienced comprehension. "Forgive the intrusion. Wesley expressed concern about your isolation given your condition, and this morning's weather convinced me intervention might be prudent." Before Sarah could respond, another contraction claimed her attention, more powerful than previous ones. The younger woman moved immediately to her side, offering supportive arm with practiced competence. "I'm Catherine Holly," she introduced herself once the contraction eased. "Wesley's sister. I have medical training and have attended numerous births. May I assist you?" The unexpected appearance of Wesley's family members, particularly under these intimate circumstances, might have been unwelcome intrusion under different conditions. But Sarah recognized genuine concern beneath their arrival, and practical necessity overrode any potential discomfort about strangers witnessing her vulnerable state. "Yes," she managed, gratitude outweighing surprise. "Thank you." Catherine nodded briskly, already assessing the situation with professional attention. "How long have you been in labor? How frequent are the contractions?" "Since yesterday evening," Sarah replied, allowing Catherine to guide her toward the bed for examination. "About 5 minutes apart now, lasting nearly a minute." "Good progress," Catherine commented, her manner shifting fully to medical practitioner rather than social visitor. She removed her coat, revealing practical dress beneath, and began washing her hands in the basin Sarah had prepared earlier. "I'll need to examine you to determine how far you have advanced." Margaret, meanwhile, had efficiently organized the cabin's space adding wood to the fire, arranging clean linens within easy reach, heating additional water on the stove. Her movements reflected experienced competence rather than uncomfortable intrusion, creating impression of someone who had managed similar situations numerous times. Wesley remained in town, she explained as she worked correctly interpreting Sarah's unasked question. The main road has become impassable, but we were able to use the old logging trail with appropriate equipment. He was quite determined to accompany us, but Catherine convinced him his presence might be more distraction than assistance during your labor. The explanation, delivered with matter-of-fact calm between practical activities, offered reassurance that Wesley hadn't abandoned her during this critical moment, information Sarah hadn't consciously needed, but found comforting nonetheless. Another contraction interrupted further conversation, this one intense enough to demand her complete focus. Catherine provided steady support, demonstrating the particular combination of technical knowledge and empathetic presence that distinguished genuinely skilled birth attendants. "You're progressing well," she announced after completing her examination. "The baby has descended properly and your body is opening as it should. I estimate perhaps 2 to 3 hours before delivery, though first births sometimes take longer than expected." The professional assessment, delivered with confidence rather than condescension, reassured Sarah that Catherine's medical training was substantial rather than superficial social accomplishment. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, she found herself trusting Wesley's sister's competence, both from necessity and from recognition of genuine skill. "Thank you," she said, simply accepting the cool cloth Margaret offered for her forehead. "I hadn't expected to meet Wesley's family under quite these circumstances." Something like humor flickered in Margaret's expression. "The Holly family has never been known for conventional timing," she observed dryly. "Though I must say meeting you during childbirth certainly accelerates the usual acquaintance process." The understated wit, delivered without pretension, despite the unusual situation, suggested family resemblance beyond physical features. Wesley possessed similar ability to find appropriate humor in challenging circumstances, quality that had helped forge their connection during isolated winter weeks. "Wesley spoke highly of you both," Sarah managed between contractions, "though I confess I had imagined more formal introduction at some future point." "Formality is overrated," Catherine replied, checking the baby's position with practiced hands, "particularly between family members." The casual inclusion, referring to Sarah as family, despite lack of official relationship, carried significance beyond the immediate conversation. Neither Holly woman had expressed judgment or reservation about the unconventional circumstances. Both had simply arrived to provide necessary support during critical need. The hours that followed created strange intimacy between women who had been strangers mere hours before. Catherine directed the birth process with quiet authority, combining frontier practicality with medical knowledge that transcended typical midwifery. Margaret provided steady support, fetching supplies, offering encouragement, maintaining the cabin's warmth and order while birth unfolded. Sarah focused primarily on her body's increasingly demanding work, nevertheless registered the unexpected blessing of experienced female assistance during process she had prepared to navigate alone. The contractions grew more powerful, the intervals between them briefer as labor progressed toward inevitable conclusion. "The baby's head is crowning," Catherine announced as evening deepened outside the cabin windows. "With the next contraction, I need you to push deliberately, not frantically, but with sustained effort." Sarah nodded, gathering strength during the momentary respite between contractions. When the next wave began building, she followed Catherine's guidance, working with her body's natural force rather than against it. The sensation of pressure peaked in burning intensity that demanded complete concentration, then suddenly released in physical surrender that announced the baby's head had emerged. "Excellent." Catherine encouraged, her hands supporting the partially born infant with practiced confidence. "Rest a moment, then one more good push should complete delivery." Margaret moved to Sarah's side, offering support that allowed semi-upright position for the final stage. "You're doing beautifully," she said, her voice carrying genuine admiration rather than mere encouragement. "Nearly finished now." The final contraction built with gathering intensity, Sarah's body instinctively responding to the culmination of months of preparation and hours of labor. With deliberate effort rather than frantic struggle, she pushed in harmony with her body's signals, feeling the baby slide into waiting hands with sudden release of pressure. Silence hung for a breathless moment, then shattered with indignant cry that announced healthy lungs and strong spirit. The sound primal declaration of new life entering the world filled the cabin with its insistent vitality. A girl, Catherine announced, quickly clearing the baby's airways and wrapping her in prepared blanket. Beautiful and appears perfectly formed. She placed the swaddled infant on Sarah's chest, allowing mother and child their first proper meeting. The baby's cries softened as she felt maternal warmth, her tiny features gradually relaxing from birth's initial outrage to curious exploration of new sensations. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, tears flowing freely as she studied the perfect miniature face. "Welcome to the world." Margaret, watching with evident emotion despite her generally composed demeanor, asked softly, "Have you chosen a name?" Sarah nodded, never taking her eyes from her daughter's face. "Hope," she said simply. "Hope, we take Hope Elizabeth Ellison." The name selected during evening conversations with Wesley carried significance beyond mere preference. Hope represented their shared vision for the future. Elizabeth honored Sarah's mother, who had begun the wedding blanket that now awaited its intended recipient. A perfect name, Catherine approved, completing necessary post-birth procedures with professional efficiency. Strong yet graceful, traditional yet optimistic. As Catherine helped Sarah settle more comfortably for recovery, Margaret busied herself with practical arrangements, preparing simple food to restore Sarah's strength, organizing the cabin for optimal convalescence, ensuring sufficient warmth as night deepened outside. "Wesley will be disappointed to have missed the actual birth," she observed as she worked, though considerably relieved to know both mother and child are healthy. "You'll return to Cooper's Creek tomorrow," Cherish asked, reluctant to relinquish the unexpected support but understanding Margaret's limited time frame. "Weather permitting," Margaret confirmed, "though Catherine will remain if you wish until Wesley can safely return." The offer, made without presumption but with genuine concern, touched Sarah deeply. These women connected to her only through Wesley had traveled through difficult conditions to provide assistance she hadn't requested but desperately needed. Their actions demonstrated family connection based on care rather than mere obligation, reinforcing her confidence in the future she and Wesley had chosen to build together. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for the gratitude she felt. Catherine smiled, the expression transforming her professional demeanor to warmer personal connection. "Wesley described you as remarkably self-sufficient," she said, "but even the strongest people occasionally benefit from assistance, a lesson my brother has only recently begun learning himself." The observation, delivered with affectionate understanding rather than criticism, suggested Catherine's approval of the partnership forming between her brother and Sarah. Despite vastly different circumstances and backgrounds, she appeared to recognize genuine compatibility in their developing relationship. As night settled fully over the snow-covered landscape, the cabin acquired peaceful atmosphere, quite different from its earlier intensity. Hope slept contentedly against Sarah's chest, her tiny features relaxed in post-birth exhaustion. Catherine arranged comfortable sleeping accommodation for herself near the fire, while Margaret claimed the rocking chair for temporary rest. Both women ensuring Sarah could summon assistance easily if needed. "Rest while she sleeps," Catherine advised, as she completed final checks of both mother and infant. "The first night often establishes patterns for those that follow." Sarah nodded, already feeling the profound exhaustion that follows intense physical effort. But beneath the tiredness lay deeper contentment, sense of completion, and new beginning simultaneously. Her daughter had arrived safely despite less than ideal circumstances. Unexpected support had manifested when most needed, and the future, while still containing challenges, held promise of genuine partnership rather than continued isolation. As she drifted towards sleep, cradling hope's warm weight against her, Sarah found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun with blizzard rescue had transformed through careful choice and growing trust into foundation for family, formed not through conventional paths, but through deliberate commitment and genuine affection. Hope Elizabeth Ellison, born during January snowstorm, with Holly women in attendance, represented physical embodiment of that evolving bond connection that transcended biological relationship to embrace chosen responsibility and authentic care. Morning brought clearing skies and strengthening sunlight that transformed snow-covered landscape into sparkling expanse of white. Inside the cabin, Hope announced her hunger with determined cries that belied her tiny size, her lungs proving as healthy in daylight as they had upon arrival. Catherine helped Sarah position the infant for nursing, offering practical suggestions without intrusive direction. Margaret prepared breakfast for the adults, maintaining efficient domestic organization that allowed Sarah to focus primarily on her newborn daughter. She has your determination, Catherine observed, watching Hope attack her first morning meal with single-minded focus. That quality will serve her well in this world. And her father's thoughtfulness, I think, Sarah added, studying the baby's features with maternal fascination. See how she pauses occasionally as if considering important matters between feedings. The reference to Wesley as father, made naturally and without qualification, drew a approving smile from Catherine. Wesley has always been the contemplative Holly, she agreed. Even as a child, he observed thoroughly before acting. Father considered it hesitation, mother recognized it as wisdom. This glimpse into Wesley's childhood provided another layer of understanding for Sarah, confirmation that the qualities she had come to value in him had deep roots rather than recent development. The thoughtfulness she appreciated had been a fundamental aspect of his character long before their paths crossed, suggesting stability that would endure beyond current circumstances. Speaking of my brother, Catherine continued, we should consider when it might be safe for him to attempt the journey here. The snow has stopped, but trail conditions remain challenging. Wesley is not known for patience when matters of importance are concerned, Margaret added dryly from her position near the stove. I imagine he's already preparing for departure, despite any cautions about weather. As if summoned by their discussion, sounds of approach reached them, horses' hooves breaking through snow, crust with determined progress. Catherine moved to the window, confirming their expectations with satisfied nod. Wesley indeed, she reported, looking rather determined for someone who was strongly advised to wait another day before attempting the trail. Margaret smiled slightly, the expression softening her normally composed features. Some advice is given with the full expectation it will be ignored, she observed, particularly when family is involved. The door opened moments later, admitting Wesley in swirl of cold air and obvious concern. Snow dusted his coat and hat, evidence of difficult journey through still challenging conditions. His gaze moved immediately to Sarah, relief replacing anxiety when he found her sitting up in bed with bundle cradled against her chest. Sarah, he breathed, removing his outerwear with hasty movements before approaching the bed. Is everything? We're perfectly fine, she assured him, shifting the blanket to reveal Hope's sleeping face. Your daughter decided to arrive a bit earlier than expected, but your family provided excellent assistance. Daughter, Wesley repeated, emotion making his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. He sat carefully on the bed's edge, studying the infant's features with wonder that transcended any distinction between biological and chosen fatherhood. She's beautiful. Perfect. Hope Elizabeth, Sarah supplied, watching his reaction carefully. They had discussed names during evening conversations, but final decision had remained open pending the child's arrival. Hope, Wesley echoed, touching the baby's tiny hand with gentle finger. Exactly right. Catherine and Margaret exchanged satisfied glances at this interaction, their expressions suggesting approval of the natural family dynamic developing before them. Without needing discussion, both women busied themselves with tasks that created illusion of privacy while remaining available if needed. Catherine organizing her medical supplies, Margaret preparing coffee for the adults. I was so worried, Wesley said quietly, his attention still fixed on Hope's peaceful features. When the snow began yesterday and Margaret suggested you might need assistance. Your family arrived at precisely the right moment, Sarah assured him. Catherine's medical training proved invaluable, and Margaret's practical support made everything considerably easier than it might have been. Wesley glanced toward his sister and aunt with genuine gratitude. Thank you both, he said simply. Words seem inadequate, but none needed, Catherine interrupted with practical kindness. Family supports family during important transitions, something you have always understood even when father considered it impractical sentimentality. The comment, offered with affectionate teasing rather than criticism, revealed comfortable relationship between siblings despite their different personalities and paths. Wesley's answering smile confirmed this impression connection based on mutual respect rather than mere biological relation. Have you sent word to Cooper's Creek? Margaret asked, practical considerations never far from her attention, despite the emotional moment. Dr. Mitchell would likely visit if informed of the birth regardless of weather conditions. Wesley nodded. I spoke with him before departing. He'll attempt the journey tomorrow if conditions improve further, primarily to ensure proper recovery rather than address immediate concerns. This arrangement, professional medical follow-up, combined with family support, represented ideal balance between frontier self-sufficiency and prudent precaution. Sarah found herself deeply appreciative of both aspects, respect for her capability without abandonment to unnecessary risk. Hope stirred against her chest, tiny features scrunching momentarily before relaxing back into newborn sleep. The simple movement drew everyone's attention, momentarily unifying the cabin's occupants in shared wonder at new life's miraculous ordinariness. She appears healthy in all respects, Catherine reported, shifting to professional assessment. Good color, strong reflexes, appropriate weight, despite arriving slightly earlier than anticipated. With proper care and no unforeseen complications, both mother and child should recover normally. The clinical summary, delivered with medical precision, yet underlying warmth, provided reassurance beyond mere emotional comfort. Catherine clearly possessed genuine expertise rather than superficial knowledge, confirming Wesley's previous descriptions of his sister's determined pursuit of medical training, despite social conventions. I've prepared detailed instructions for Wesley regarding postpartum care. She continued, addressing Sarah directly. Though I suspect your mother's herbal knowledge provides foundation for many of the same approaches I would recommend. The respectful acknowledgement of Sarah's own medical heritage, traditional wisdom passed through generations of frontier women, created unexpected connection between the educated doctor's daughter and self-sufficient homesteader. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, both understood the practical value of knowledge that supported survival in challenging circumstances. Margaret and I should return to Cooper's Creek this afternoon, Catherine added, glancing toward the window where strengthening sunlight suggested improving conditions. The trail will become more difficult after dark, and Dr. Mitchell will likely attempt the journey tomorrow, regardless of my presence. Wesley looked momentarily torn between gratitude for their assistance and reluctance to see them depart so soon after Hope's arrival. Are you certain the cabin can accommodate everyone if necessary, albeit somewhat crowded? Margaret shook her head with practical decisiveness. A new family needs space for adjustment without excessive company, regardless of good intentions. Masan, she added with slight smile, my business interests require attention before our departure for Texas. The reference to pending departure created momentary tension in the cabin's atmosphere, reminder that decisions about Wesley's plans remain partially unresolved, despite his and Sarah's private commitment to shared future. Neither Catherine nor Margaret had directly addressed the understanding developing between Wesley and Sarah, maintaining respectful distance from relationship, still finding its formal definition. About Texas, Wesley began, carefully glancing towards Sarah with question in his expression. At her subtle nod, he continued more confidently. Sarah and I have discussed our future extensively. We've decided to build our life here in Montana, establish a ranch using combined resources and shared vision. The announcement, delivered without apology or defensive explanation, hung in the cabin's quiet atmosphere. Catherine's expression registered immediate approval, unsurprising given her previous indications of support. Margaret's reaction proved more measured, not disapproval, but thoughtful consideration that weighed multiple factors beyond emotional preference. Father will be disappointed, she observed finally, practical rather than judgmental, though perhaps not surprised given recent developments. I've written explaining my decision, Wesley responded, acknowledging family obligations while clarifying my need to establish independent path forward. Margaret nodded, accepting this approach. And your intentions regarding Mrs. Ellison and her daughter? The question, though potentially intrusive, was presented with dignified directness rather than inappropriate curiosity. Wesley moved to stand beside Sarah's bed, his position physically demonstrating commitment before he verbalized it. We intend to marry as soon as Reverend Morrison makes his spring circuit through the valley, he stated firmly. Hope will carry the Holly name, and any subsequent children will know no distinction between siblings regardless of biological parentage. The declaration, made without qualification or hesitation, created visible impression on both Holly women. Catherine's expression softened with evident approval, while Margaret studied Wesley with evaluative attention that gradually transformed to acceptance. "You've considered this thoroughly?" she asked, though her tone suggested confirmation rather than challenge. "More thoroughly than any previous decision in my life," Wesley affirmed. "This isn't impulsive rebellion or romantic fantasy. It's deliberate choice based on genuine partnership and shared values." Margaret glanced towards Sarah, including her directly in the conversation, rather than discussing her future as passive subject. "And you, Mrs. Ellison? This represents your considered choice as well." The direct question, offered with respect rather than interrogation, allowed Sarah opportunity to articulate her own perspective rather than merely accept Wesley's presentation. She appreciated this inclusion, recognizing in it Margaret's fundamental belief in women's agency regardless of conventional social limitations. "It does," Sarah confirmed, her voice steady despite physical exhaustion from recent delivery. "Wesley and I have built understanding based on genuine knowledge rather than superficial attraction or convenient arrangement. Our commitment represents careful choice rather than desperate necessity." Something in her phrasing appeared to particularly satisfy Margaret, whose expression relaxed into approval more genuine than mere social acceptance. "Then you have my support," she said simply, both practical and personal. The straightforward endorsement, offered without excessive sentimentality, but with evident sincerity, carried significant weight from someone of Margaret Holly's position and character. Wesley's obvious relief suggested he had valued his aunt's approval more than he might have acknowledged previously. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Your understanding means more than I can adequately express." "Understanding requires no special insight in this case," Margaret replied with unexpected warmth. "Anyone observing your interaction recognizes genuine compatibility rather than temporary arrangement." Catherine, who had been organizing her medical supplies during this exchange, added her own perspective with characteristic directness. "Father will eventually reconcile himself to reality, Wesley. His disappointment stems from thwarted business plans rather than genuine concern about your happiness. And those business concerns have largely resolved themselves through Eleanor's marriage," Margaret added practically. "The Whitman alliance would have addressed specific financial challenges that now require different solutions, concerns you're no longer solely responsible for addressing." This pragmatic assessment, separating emotional reactions from business considerations, typified Margaret's approach to family matters. Her support for Wesley's choice appeared based on recognition of genuine compatibility rather than mere indulgence of personal preference, giving her approval substantive weight beyond mere sentiment. "We should prepare for departure," she continued, glancing toward the strengthening sunlight visible through the cabin's window. "The trail will remain passable for several hours yet, but prudence suggests not tempting weather unnecessarily." The practical consideration characteristic of frontier experience, regardless of social standing, reminded everyone that Montana's winter conditions commanded respect from visitors and residents alike. Catherine nodded agreement, completing her organization of medical supplies with efficient movements. "I've left detailed instructions for Wesley regarding your recovery," she told Sarah, professional concern evident in her expression. "Dr. Mitchell will likely visit tomorrow to confirm all progress is normally, but follow these guidelines in the meantime, particularly regarding rest and hydration, both critical for proper healing and milk production." The medical advice, delivered with professional authority tempered by personal warmth, demonstrated Catherine's genuine concern beyond mere family obligation. Sarah found herself appreciating this combination of technical knowledge and empathetic understanding, qualities that transcended social differences to create authentic connection. "Thank you," she said simply, the words encompassing gratitude beyond mere medical assistance. "For everything." Catherine smiled, the expression transforming her professional demeanor to warmer personal connection. "Welcome to the Holly family," she said quietly. "Unconventional entrances are something of a tradition among us, despite appearances to the contrary." The comment, offered with genuine inclusion rather than condescending acceptance, suggested Catherine's wholehearted approval of the developing relationship between her brother and Sarah. Despite vast differences in their backgrounds and circumstances, she appeared to recognize essential compatibility that transcended superficial distinctions. Preparations for departure proceeded efficiently, with Wesley assisting his relatives while Sarah rested with Hope nestled against her chest. The baby slept peacefully, apparently untroubled by the activities surrounding her first full day of life. Sarah found herself studying the tiny features with wonder that transcended her physical exhaustion, this perfect being who had entered the world amid snowstorm and family drama, yet maintained serene presence throughout. "She has your calm temperament," Wesley observed, returning to her bedside after helping load his relative's traveling equipment, observing thoroughly before deciding whether situations warrant response. The comment, offered with gentle humor yet genuine perception, demonstrated his developing connection to Hope relationship based on choice rather than obligation, genuine affection rather than mere responsibility. Sarah felt renewed confidence in their decision to build family together, regardless of unconventional beginning or potential challenges ahead. Final farewells combined practical arrangements with emotional connection, Catherine promising to send additional medical supplies, with Dr. Mitchell Margaret arranging financial matters to support the new family's establishment without creating dependency. Both women demonstrated genuine concern, balanced with respect for the new parents' independence and decision-making authority. "All right when we reach Texas," Margaret assured Wesley as she prepared to depart, "providing honest assessment of father's condition and response to your letter. Aunt will return for a proper visit when weather permits easier travel." Catherine added, her gaze moving between Wesley, Sarah, and the sleeping infant. "Aunts should maintain proper connection with their nieces regardless of distance." The casual inclusion referring to Hope as niece without qualification regarding biological relationship reinforced Catherine's earlier welcome. In her perspective, family connection clearly transcended conventional definitions to embrace chosen bonds as readily as inherited ones. As the Holly women departed their sleigh, creating delicate tracks across snow-covered landscape, Wesley and Sarah exchanged glances that contained equal parts wonder and relief. The past 24 hours had brought profound changes, not just Hope's arrival, but first direct encounter between their vastly different worlds, and beginning confirmation that bridges between those worlds might prove stronger than initially anticipated. "They approve of us," Sarah observed, quietly adjusting Hope's position as the baby stirred slightly against her chest. "More importantly, they respect us," Wesley clarified, settling beside her on the bed with careful movement that avoided disturbing either mother or infant. Both individually and as partners, building something meaningful together. The distinction between mere approval and genuine respect reflected Wesley's evolving understanding of truly valuable family connection. Throughout his life, approval had often been conditional upon meeting expectations established by others. Respect acknowledged personal agency and authentic choice, regardless of conventional standards. "Your sister is remarkable," Sarah commented, genuinely impressed by Catherine's combination of professional competence and personal warmth. "Her medical knowledge likely saved us considerable difficulty during delivery." Catherine has always defined her own path," Wesley agreed, pride evident in his expression. "Father initially opposed her medical studies as unfeminine distraction, but her determination eventually wore down even his resistance." This glimpse into family dynamics provided additional context for Wesley's own journey toward independent decision-making, having witnessed his sister's successful assertion of personal choice despite paternal opposition. He had perhaps absorbed important lessons about determination and authentic self-direction. "And Margaret?" Sarah asked, curious about the more reserved but clearly influential Holly matriarch. "Margaret represents what Holly women have always been beneath social conformity," Wesley explained thoughtfully. "Practical, intelligent, determined to direct their own affairs regardless of conventional limitations. Father considers her eccentric but useful. Those who know her better recognize genuine wisdom beneath pragmatic exterior." This assessment suggested family complexity beyond simple patriarchal dominance. Women who maintained substantial independence despite social constraints. Men who struggled between business imperatives and personal relationships. Wesley's decision to prioritize authentic partnership over financial advantage reflected reevaluation of these fundamental tensions rather than mere rebellion against specific expectations. Hope stirred more decisively, her tiny features contracting momentarily before relaxing into different expression, the constantly changing micro-expressions that fascinated new parents regardless of circumstances. Wesley watched with wonder that transcended any distinction between biological and chosen fatherhood, his finger gently tracing her miniature features with reverent attention. "Welcome to our family, Hope Elizabeth," he whispered, however unconventional its beginning might appear. The simple statement offered with quiet certainty rather than defensive justification, crystallized everything they had been building toward since his arrival during December's blizzard. Family formed not through conventional paths or social expectations, but through deliberate choice and genuine commitment. Connection stronger precisely because it had been thoughtfully created rather than merely inherited or assumed. Sarah watched this interaction with deepening confidence in their shared future. The journey ahead would contain challenges establishing viable ranch operations, navigating complex family relationships, building community connections that respected their unconventional beginning. But the foundation they had created through winter's isolation and spring's new beginnings provided solid basis for whatever difficulties might arise. Outside, January sunlight transformed snow-covered landscape into brilliant expanse of possibility, clean slate, awaiting their combined vision and effort. Inside, two adults and newborn infant represented new family unit created through circumstance choice and genuine affection rather than conventional expectation or social requirement. We should rest while she sleeps. Wesley suggested practical consideration, balancing emotional significance of the moment. Dr. Mitchell will likely arrive tomorrow, and you'll need strength for that examination. Sarah nodded, already feeling exhaustion from birth and subsequent interactions pulling her toward much-needed sleep. As Wesley adjusted blankets around her and the baby, his movements combining careful attention with genuine tenderness, she found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment of shared beginning. What had started with rescue during blizzard had evolved through careful conversation and growing trust into foundation for family formed through choice rather than chance connection that transcended conventional definitions to embrace deeper understanding of partnership's true meaning. Hope Elizabeth Ellison, soon to become Hope Elizabeth Holly, represented physical embodiment of that evolving bond bridge between past circumstances and future possibilities. Living symbol of promises made not through hasty emotion, but through thoughtful commitment to shared vision and genuine affection. As sleep claimed her, Sarah's last conscious awareness was Wesley's steady presence beside the bed, his watchful attention encompassing both mother and child, with protective care that promised not just immediate safety, but lasting commitment. Whatever challenges awaited beyond the cabin's sheltering walls, they would face them together, family created through deliberate choice rather than mere circumstance. Stronger precisely because its foundations rested on mutual respect and authentic connection. Outside Montana, winter continued its patient reign, stars emerging in darkening sky as day yielded to evening. Inside, new family rested in peaceful unity, their shared future awaiting spring's arrival, and opportunities to build something genuine and lasting from winter's unexpected beginning. The promise made in snow had been fulfilled, transforming strangers into family through the quiet miracle of chosen love. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Sonnet 3.7.